70% of all the buildings in London are houses. From mansions to maisonettes, from high-rise flats to penthouses, the variety of different homes in London is astounding. In the last 15 years, London's population has increased by more than 500,000. Throughout its history, one of the biggest problems facing the city has been finding homes for all the new arrivals, the rich and the poor. Look around London, and if you're lucky, you'll see an ancient building technique that's been around for over 6,000 years. It's called wattle and daub, and it's so old there's barely any evidence of it left in the capital. But until the mid-17th century, it was a feature of nearly every house in London. In ancient times, our ancestors would have lived in wattle and daub huts like this. Gary Breyer and John Sharman are restoration experts and often use the wattle and daub technique to repair buildings like the interior of this cottage in Kent. This is the wattle, the wooden bit, and the daub is the sludge they're putting on it. John, what's it made of, the daub?
Yeah, this particular daub has clay, topsoil, chopped straw in it, a little bit of lime, and a little bit of cow dung.
Cow dung? Have you got a lot of that in here?
No, you'll be fine.
Doesn't smell much.
No, there's not a vast amount in this, but it varies from region to region of how much cow dung, urine, blood and things like that was put into it.
Oh, charming.
Yes, very pretty, isn't it?
Could I have a go?
By all means, yeah.
There's not too much cow dung in there, is there?
No, you'll be fine.
So what do I want, a big handful?
Yeah, nice big handful, which is called a cat.
What, a cat?
Yes.
Doesn't look much like a cat. Okay, and then do we need to do it matching?
Yeah, it's best to.
Where?
He's going to do it
Here somewhere?
Push in towards the... And push back in this.
This way?
Yeah,
oh, towards the old stuff, I see.
Use the palm of your hand.
Right, I'm pushing it all off now. I'm destroying what you've just done. One small problem, it was pretty easy to smash your way through a wattle and daub wall, which may be where the term breaking and entering came from. There, oh, smooth as a baby's bum. And this really has been around a long time, has it?
Yeah, 6,000 years plus.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. But there was one big problem with wattle and daub: fire. In 1666, the Great Fire of London ripped through the city's narrow medieval streets. Buildings constructed from timber, wattle and daub were burnt to the ground in seconds. From then on, legislation insisted that all new buildings should be built out of brick or stone, and so London's love affair with wattle and daub came to a charred and smoky end. It's hard to imagine now, but back in the 16th century, Hackney was noted for its peacefulness and its healthy air. And that's why a whole lot of courtiers and wealthy London merchants chose Hackney for their country retreats. This is Sutton House, built in 1535 and originally called Brick Place because it was built entirely of brick. Now, in those days, bricks were very expensive, and if you could afford a few, you built your fireplace and your chimney out of brick so that your wattle and daub house didn't burn down. And the idea of building an entire house out of brick was quite extraordinary. People riding their horses into Bishopsgate over the open fields would stop and stare in amazement. And of course, building on this scale required an entirely new skill: bricklaying. Sutton House was built by Sir Ralph Sadler, a Tudor courtier who worked his way up through the court of Henry VIII. It's one of the oldest residential buildings in London and a rare example of a red brick building from the Tudor period. I'm now in the basement of Sutton House, and I've just been looking at the pattern of the brickwork, and that's really interesting. I'm no bricklayer, so I'm going to use Wheater bricks, and to stick them together I'm going to use toothpaste. Now, I just need a bit more of this mortar here. Squirt along there, and back along there. And if you're just laying a single thickness of brick, this wall is only half a brick thick, then the obvious way to lay the bricks is so that each one overlaps the gap in the course underneath. Each line is called a course. And these are called stretchers because you're looking at the side of them. And then you see that's not going to fall apart that way because this one holds those two together. Very simple. But if you want a stronger wall, what you need to do is have it thicker. Ideally, at least a whole brick's length thick. And that's what I've done here. And you'll see at the bottom, I've got a layer of stretchers, but then I've got a layer where you can only see the ends of the brick. They're called headers. And then another layer of stretchers and another layer of headers. And here I'll lay another layer of stretchers on top, so lots more mortar. Jolly good this. The great advantage of this sort of wall is that you can have your breakfast and clean your teeth at the same time. And then these stretchers go along like this. Now make sure that they cover both the two gaps underneath, and I'll do exactly the same behind, and then both the two gaps underneath, and exactly the same behind. And the point is that all the gaps here are going to be covered by the bricks above, so they won't separate that way. And these headers cover both layers of brick, so the two layers aren't going to fall apart that way. So it's very, very strong. This particular pattern is called English Bond. And if you look here, it's exactly the pattern here. Stretchers, headers, stretchers, headers, and so on. Isn't that lovely? After the Great Fire, many aristocratic residents didn't return to the City of London, preferring more fashionable new neighbourhoods in the West End. Among the first architects to capitalise on the speculative housing boom of the 18th century were the Adam brothers from Scotland. Robert Adam went round the continent studying classical architecture and incorporated into his own designs ideas from the Roman, the Greek and the Byzantine. He came back here in 1758, joined forces with his brother James, and together they secured one of their first commissions here in Queen Anne Street, Chandos House. At this point, the Adam brothers were famed for their interior design, earning themselves a reputation for absolute attention to detail. Today, an original Robert Adam fireplace would be worth up to £500,000. But this was the first time they had built an entire house from scratch. Robert seized his chance to try out all those things that he'd learnt on the continent. So the house became a sort of showpiece for his skills. It's full of grotesque flat panels, complicated colour schemes, painted flags and ribbons, and indeed all the walls are painted with bright pastel colours, apparently to show up well in candlelight. Like many developments in the 1700s, Chandos House was built speculatively, using money borrowed from a banker and the family trust. Speculative projects were high-risk investments, so the brothers were relieved when in 1744 James Brydges, the third and last Duke of Chandos, bought the house for £11,000. The Adam brothers went on to complete bigger and grander assignments, including the whole of Portland Place, just round the corner. They're considered by many to be the finest architects of the late 18th century and the leaders of the neoclassical revival in England. The Adam brothers were among the first to capitalise on the speculative market boom, and many others followed in their footsteps. Thomas Cubitt was the son of a Norfolk farmer. At first he earned his living as a ship's carpenter, but when he'd saved enough money he came to London and opened a building firm on Gray's Inn Road. Then in 1824 he was commissioned by this chap, Robert Grosvenor, to build a new development in Belgravia, and it became Belgrave Square. Cubitt had already earned himself a reputation as a master developer, but Belgravia presented him with his biggest challenge yet: to provide public services for the growing population of fussy middle-class tenants without compromising the environment and tone of the area. This 4.5-acre garden in the middle of the square is surrounded by a dense belt of shrubbery. The idea was to give the residents a private area reminiscent of their country retreats outside London. Cubitt was a visionary, not only because he was the first large-scale commercial builder, but also because he changed the way building workers were employed. Instead of hiring in freelancers, he employed his own workforce, including dozens of brickmakers, masons, painters and plasterers, and that's the model which has been used ever since. What's more, he was a very generous employer. He's credited with inventing the tea break. So, if you've been plagued by builders who keep stopping for tea, Cubitt's the man to blame. The Belgravia project would have been a modern-day developer's dream. It's located south of Hyde Park and just a stone's throw from Buckingham Palace. The square consists of 4 imposing Greco-Roman blocks marked by 4 corner mansions. You can see how the earlier work of the Adam brothers must have influenced Cubitt as he designed the buildings. The development was a success from the start, and it got a huge boost when George IV decided to turn Buckingham House, just over there, into Buckingham Palace. Then the square itself got the royal seal of approval when Queen Victoria decided to rent number 36 for her mum. Houses on the square cost around £15 million, and it's a testament to Cubitt that Belgravia remains fashionable and sought after. Current tenants include Baroness Margaret Thatcher and Roman Abramovich. But not far from the mansions of Belgravia, the growing working-class slums were becoming harder and harder for middle-class Londoners to ignore. Look down many residential streets in London and you'll see rows and rows of terraced houses. The 19th century saw London become the world's largest city. Its population grew from 1 million in 1800 to 6.7 million a century later. During this period, the capital experienced an unprecedented housing boom, and the terraced house became the middle-class home of choice. External decoration was a way for the middle-class Victorians to show their wealth and status, and all sorts of styles were used, from Gothic to classical. Bay windows distinguished middle-class terrace houses from the flat fronts of working-class terraces. However, there was one attribute that both middle-class and working-class houses had in common. Most were made from yellow London stock brick. If ever a building material could claim the title of the brick that built London, then the traditional yellow stock is the one. Thousands and thousands of houses have been built in London using the traditional yellow stock brick. And those are made with brick earth, which comes out of the fields here overlooking the Medway River. Now, the chap responsible is Steve Knight. You're the process manager?
That is correct.
In
yes.
stock brick?
Yes.
And you're responsible for this hole in the ground?
Well, partly. Partly. Yes, we have to take the brick earth to make the yellow stock brick. We extract the brick earth,
right,
and then the topsoil gets laid back so the farmer gets his field back.
So it's as good as new?
It goes back
just
to
a bit lower?
One agricultural land, yes.
Right. If I take a bit here,
yeah.
This is real brick earth?
Yes, that breaks open.
Oh yeah, it's quite crumbly, isn't it?
Yes, when it's dried, yes.
So, but the bricks are yellower than that, aren't they?
Yes, and the yellowness actually comes out of the chalk.
But chalk's white.
There's inherent chalk in the brick earth, probably
right,
up to about 4%. Then we have to add virgin chalk to make up to about 10% to get the yellowness.
Can we go and see how you actually make the bricks?
We certainly can.
Come and show me.
Okay.
So, the brick earth is loaded onto lorries and taken to the factory, where it's dumped into huge bins called hoppers. It's then mixed with ingredients like clay, chalk and sand and fed through a pan mill, where any flint is crushed by these 5-ton wheels. The earth is then put into moulds, ready for the dryer. You couldn't make a house with these yet?
No, not at this stage.
Right.
At this stage now, they've just come out, they've just been pressed, and as you can see...
Hey! It's just like wet sand, isn't it? So what happens to them next?
Once they go from here, they go through and they go into the dryer.
Dryer, let's have a look at that.
Okay.
So this is the dryer, yes?
This is the dryer.
Oh, it's quite warm, isn't it?
Yes, it's quite humid as well.
Right, yeah, it feels really, yeah, like a sauna.
Yes.
But they haven't been fired yet.
No, once they come out the other end of the dryer, then they're getting ready to be set into profiles, ready to go up to be fired.
Let's go and have a look at the next stage. Is this a good one?
Yes, it's a good one to look at.
It feels quite hot to me. Wow, they look really hot. What sort of temperature is that?
Looking at the colour, that's above 900 degrees C.
So close to 1,000.
I would say it's coming up that way. Yeah.
You wouldn't want to put your hand in, would you?
Certainly wouldn't.
Bright yellow heat. After the kiln, the bricks are sorted into piles and the rejects reused as hardcore. At 30p a brick, the stock is relatively expensive by building trade standards, but any brickie will tell you they're worth every penny. Presumably people like them slightly irregular like this, do they?
Yes, because of stock brick, they don't want them dead square or rectangular.
Right.
They don't like sharp edges because you lose the character.
And that's what people want, character.
Correct, yes.
Right. And what does it say there in the frog?
That's how it works, Funton works.
Funton, I see. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. From the Kentish fields overlooking the Medway River to the townhouses of London, this is a process that's been going on for over 2 centuries, and the Funton Works are one of the only brickmakers in the UK still using the traditional methods. And with demand in the capital still high, London stock will continue to earn its reputation as the brick that built London. With the arrival of the railway, the Victorian middle-class housing boom spread to leafy suburbs like Wimbledon to the south and Crouch End to the north. But this left thousands of poor in the already overcrowded East London slums. The slums, known as rookeries, were polluted ghettos, famed for prostitution, gambling and crime. One of these slums, known as the Old Nicole, stood here on what is now Arnold Circus in Tower Hamlets. I'm now with someone who really knows what those Victorian slums were like. Dr. Anne Kirshen from Queen Mary College. Anne, you weren't there at the time, were you? No, but you're a historian.
I am indeed.
Tell me, was it really bad?
It was dreadful. You had some 6,000 people living in some 731 dwellings.
Ouch.
1 in 4 children died before their first birthday. Running water wasn't something that they enjoyed. Henry Mayhew, sometime earlier, writes about the Irish keeping pigs in their houses. But it would be commonplace. There would be cows around because that would be where the milk would be supplied.
Right.
Feral dogs and cats.
All right, you've convinced me. How did it all end?
In 1887, Charles Booth published a report on poverty in Tower Hamlets, which shocked society because it was at such a high level, conditions were so poor. This coincided with the creation of the London County Council in 1889, who decided that they would demolish what was the Old Nicole Rookery and build in its place, the first time ever, social housing or council housing.
So you mean these are the first council houses?
These are the first council houses.
Oh, wonderful. They're really nice. And did all the people from here move into the nice new houses?
Oh, no. It doesn't work like that. They were pushed eastward, and only those who could afford the regular rents and abide by the rules, they were the only people that could move in.
I'm awfully glad I wasn't here then.
So am I, yes.
When they knocked down the old slums, they pushed all the rubble together into a big heap in the middle of the park, and they built a brand new bandstand on top of it. So I'm now standing quite literally on the remains of the Old Nicole. Good riddance! After the First World War, there was a fear that a revolution could break out if the working-class soldiers had to return to the same poor and overcrowded conditions they'd left behind. And so the Homes for Heroes scheme was set up, creating 2 million homes for the working class. But peace was short-lived, and during World War II, many of those new homes were destroyed during the Blitz. So rebuilding became a desperate priority. Early in the 20th century, pioneering architects in Europe developed a new way of constructing buildings. It came to be called modernism, and this is it. One of the modernist architects who was commissioned to help solve London's housing crisis was Erno Goldfinger. Goldfinger was an outspoken Marxist whose life was surrounded by controversy. In the late 60s, he built Balfron Tower, a bold, stark design incorporating all the hallmarks of the modernist style. When the first residents arrived, they were rather surprised to find Goldfinger and his artist wife Ursula living in a flat on the very top floor. What's more, the Goldfingers threw lavish champagne parties and invited all the residents and asked them to say what they liked or disliked about the building. Well, they'd probably never tasted champagne before, but at least it goes to show that Goldfinger had a heart of gold. Cheers! After Balfron, Goldfinger went on to build Trellick Tower in West London. But during the 1970s, the poverty experienced by the tenants of the high-rise projects like Balfron soon became associated with the design of the buildings. Goldfinger refused to believe that his buildings were to blame. He said instead it was bad management and poor maintenance. but controversy dogged him until his death in 1987. However, towards the end of the 20th century, buildings like Trellick and Balfron came to be more appreciated. Indeed, they're both Grade 2 listed, and some people consider them a triumph for modernist architecture. In fact, Trellick Tower is now so fashionable that a 2-bedroom apartment is worth up to £350,000. Capri? Marbella? No. East London. If you were to come to Donnybrook Quarter in Bow on a sunny day, you'd be forgiven for thinking you'd been transported to the Mediterranean. The development is designed to reclaim the streets, and it's proof positive that Goldfinger's modernist dream is still alive and kicking. I'm joined now by Peter Barber, the chap who actually built this complex. Peter, it's very unusual. How did you come to this idea?
Well, these are ideas that emerged over a number of years in discussion with people that we've been designing houses for. And they just said, well, we'd love to not have to go through a staircase shared with 100 other people. We'd like to have our own front door. And the other thing they said was, we'd love to have our own little bit of outside space.
This must be very low density.
Yeah, it looks sort of cosy and cuddly and cottagey, but actually this is a high density project, and we've achieved that by kind of spreading the whole site.
Ah, so you've pushed all the buildings to the outside and made space in the middle. Peter, aren't you a bit worried with all this white paint that graffiti artists will come along and ruin it all?
It's an anxiety, but the project's been here for a year and a half and we've not had any graffiti.
None?
None at all. And I think the reason for that is that it's just very, very well overlooked space. I mean, one of the reasons why streets work well is that people feel safe in them.
Peter is just one of thousands of architects and planners who throughout London's history have reinvented old ways of building. London has always been in a state of regeneration, and the pressure for decent housing now is as intense as it's ever been. The Donnybrook Quarter and developments like it are just one example of how architects are constantly dreaming up new ways to balance the comfort of the individual with the needs of society. "50,000 people die in London every year, and the way Londoners have dealt with illness and death across the centuries has shaped the very fabric of the city. From up here on Hampstead Heath, London is a wonderful living city, but it's also a city of the dead, because you could say that our capital is one big graveyard with our ancestors buried all over the place, some of them even up here. High above London is one of the city's oldest burial grounds. Back in the Bronze Age, when a chieftain died, they'd take his body and cremate it, and then put the ashes in an urn and put that on the ground and build a mound, burial mound or tumulus. Well, up here on Hampstead Heath, there's a tumulus, look, here. It rises about, 7 or 8 feet, and there are mounds like this in other places around London, in Richmond and in Greenwich. They date back 4,500 years, till long before London as a place existed at all. With the arrival of Christianity, people rejected cremation in favour of burying their dead. By the Middle Ages, the church dominated society, and the parishes were responsible for all who dwelt in them, the living and the dead, and burials took place in the church graveyards. But these small graveyards couldn't cope when deadly plague struck London. In 1348, the Black Death wiped out half the population, around 40,000 people. And 300 years later, at the height of the Great Plague of 1665, thousands were dying every week. To cope with the piles of rotting bodies, huge pits up to 40 feet long and 20 feet deep had to be dug on the outskirts of the city. And these mass graves were left unmarked, with no memorial to the dead. As time passed, the pits were built over. One was rediscovered when the Piccadilly line was being excavated. There were so many skeletons that it was impossible to tunnel through, and that's said to be why the tube line curves between Knightsbridge and South Kensington. Today, we're still uncovering the secrets of London's burial grounds. In one of the most significant discoveries of recent times, an incredible 10,500 skeletons were found right next to Spitalfields Market, east of the city. This graveyard was found alongside the remains of a 13th century priory. It's likely that the monks and nuns were battling to save victims of a deadly epidemic in one of the city's earliest hospitals. During the Middle Ages, people who were ill were looked after in the priories, which were, in effect, the first hospitals. In those days, people often used to go off on pilgrimages, and the priories provided hospitality for the pilgrims on their travels. Then that got extended to looking after pilgrims who weren't very well, or local people who were sick or old or destitute. But things got bad when Henry VIII started dissolving the monasteries. Most of the priories closed down and the buildings were sold off. Alarmed that without the priories there was no one to look after the sick and the dying, the city authorities persuaded the king to keep 3 London hospitals open. St Mary of Bethlehem, which was the original Bedlam, one of the world's oldest psychiatric hospitals, St Bartholomew's in Smithfield, which is still there today, and St Thomas's in Southwark by London Bridge. These 3 were the only principal hospitals in London for another 200 years. St Thomas's was forced to leave its original medieval site in 1865 to make way for the expansion of London Bridge Station. But one part of the old hospital was left behind in St Thomas's Church, forgotten about for nearly 100 years. In 1956, an attic space was opened to uncover an old operating theatre dating from 1822, the oldest surviving theatre in the country. And this is it. This is the operating theatre. And it really was a theatre because leaning on these rails all the way around would be 150 medical students fascinated with the operation going on below. In Victorian times, all the surgeons would have been men, but Sarah knows all about how it operated. Now, Sarah, why did they build an operating theatre above a church?
Well, it was actually because the women's wards were right next door, so directly through where the back wall of the theatre is now was Dorcas Ward,
just there?
The surgical ward, yeah.
Right.
Before they built this place, they actually did the operations on the female patients on the ward itself.
What sort of operations did they carry out?
The 2 major operations were lithotomy, or cutting for the stones to remove bladder stones.
Oh, I see, yes, OK.
And amputation.
So how do they do amputations?
Well, this is the amputation set here. What the surgeon would do is you'd start off with your knife. One of the methods would be to cut round the limb all the way through to the bone, and then once you'd pull back the flesh to expose the bone, you'd use the saw and
to go through the bone. Ah, that's going to take about half an hour.
Well, as a matter of fact, the amputations were very quick indeed. Most surgeons could amputate in a couple of minutes, and some of the faster ones could do the majority of the amputation in about 30 seconds.
30 seconds? There must have been masses of blood. What did they do about that?
A lot of the blood they'd attempt to get into the blood box, which is underneath the table.
Ah, with sawdust. It hasn't got blood in it now, has it?
No, not now. Apparently, it would sometimes come to resemble what they called bloody porridge, that they'd put for more sawdust to be put in there.
Oh, because otherwise it would have dripped through into the church below.
Yes, they were very worried about that when the theatre was first built, so it was built with a double floor, 2 layers of wooden floor and sawdust in between, so that would soak up anything that missed the blood box.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I feel much better. Oh. Although Victorian surgery was meant to save lives, a great many patients succumbed to shock, blood loss or infection and died. And 150 years ago, finding enough space for London's dead was about as pressing a problem as finding space for the living. During the first half of the 19th century, the population of London doubled to 2.5 million, and it early on became apparent they didn't have space to bury their dead. All the little parish graveyards in the city were full to overflowing with bodies being buried on top of one another. So in 1832, Parliament passed a bill encouraging people to build private cemeteries out in the suburbs. Over the next decade, 7 cemeteries were set up, known as the Magnificent Seven: Kensal Green, West Norwood, Highgate, Abney Park, Nunhead, Brompton and Tower Hamlets. The most famous of these is Highgate Cemetery, a place of hidden beauty and magnificent neo-Gothic architecture. Highgate was created by Stephen Geary, a great Victorian inventor, entrepreneur and architect who also designed London's first gin palace. To make the cemetery a commercial success, he knew he had to create something spectacular that catered for his Victorian customers' tastes.
The Victorians were mad about Egypt because after the Napoleonic Wars, a whole lot of explorers went out to Egypt and brought stuff back and gave it to the British Museum. So when he was designing Highgate Cemetery, Geary built a sort of Egyptian corner, and you'll see here some wonderful pillars, and then there a great big obelisk, which would be a wonderful memorial, but it isn't actually to anyone, it's just saying here is a bit of Egypt. Behind me is Egyptian Avenue, and he created a whole lot of catacombs by digging 12 feet into the hillside on either side, and in here there are 16 family vaults.
The Egyptian Avenue leads to a huge cedar of Lebanon, encircled by tombs, known as the Circle of Lebanon. The tree was already about 150 years old when Geary was planning the cemetery.
This building here is known as the Terrace Catacombs, and it's one of the largest buildings in any cemetery in the country. In fact, it's 110 yards long, and inside there are 840 recesses, each just big enough to take one coffin. Now, some of these places are obviously very posh. Look at this one, Frederick Giles Broxholm, who's got his name on there 3 times. But a lot of the ones along there are anonymous. They've got no labels on at all. And possibly they were just holding places for families who are waiting to have their mausoleum built elsewhere.
When Highgate opened in 1839, it was an immediate success. And amongst its celebrity residents are Michael Faraday, Christina Rossetti and George Eliot. But the most famous of all is Karl Marx, the father of communism. Thousands of visitors come to pay their respects every year.
One of the largest and most impressive of all the various memorials here is this one. This is the mausoleum of Julius Beer, who is proprietor of The Observer. As a Jew who had converted to Anglicanism, Beer felt he was never really accepted by London society. And maybe this extraordinary mausoleum was his way of putting himself firmly on the map. It's actually modelled on the tomb of King Mausolus of Halicarnassus in Turkey, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And that was the origin of the word mausoleum.
Today, very few people are buried in the older West Cemetery, and the only way the public can see it is on a tour. But it remains a testament to Stephen Geary's vision, a magnificent architectural ode to the dead. In the mid-19th century, London was desperate for more space to bury its dead, and so 7 new private cemeteries were built, called the Magnificent Seven. The first to open in 1833 was Kensal Green.
The man behind Kensal Green Cemetery was a barrister called George Frederick Carden. He saw the commercial potential for these new private cemeteries, especially as, around the time of the 1832 Act of Parliament, London was gripped by its first ever epidemic of cholera. He changed the name of his company from the Burial Grounds Association to the General Cemetery Company. Cemetery was a new word, and he knew that his educated customers would enjoy that name because cemetery came from the Greek, and it meant dormitory or sleeping place.
Carden was inspired by the great garden cemetery of Père Lachaise in Paris. Kensal Green's 72 acres were laid out with sweeping drives and beautiful landscaping. 2 of George III's children are buried here, Princess Sophia and the Duke of Sussex. With this royal seal of approval, Kensal Green became known as the Belgravia of Death and attracted the crème de la crème of society. The great Victorian novelists Thackeray and Trollope are here, and the entrepreneur W.H. Smith. Families clamoured to secure a plot in the grounds or under the Anglican chapel in the catacombs, the largest in London.
It's quite dark and quite damp and quite spooky down here, cold too. And Joe, do you actually live down here?
No, I don't, but I'm one of the friends of Kensal Green Cemetery.
Oh, good, so you know all about it.
I hope so.
Why would people choose to be buried down here in the dark?
There were various reasons. One was kudos. It cost more to be buried down here, to be deposited down here, sorry.
So you're grander if you...
Oh, yes. 3 guineas for a plot in the cemetery, 15 guineas for a space down here.
But that gives you a space forever, does it?
Oh, yes, in perpetuity.
Right. So is that why they're all locked up behind these great...
Yes, partly. And also partly for show, and also partly the English like to tuck themselves away behind doors and fences.
OK, it's quite damp down here, isn't it? Do the coffins decay?
No. Well, they do on the external part. You have to understand that the coffins down here are triple shell coffins.
Triple shell?
Coffins. They have to be. The idea is that the body contents stay within the coffin. They do not leak out. So we have the original coffin, which contains the body. Around that, they made a thick shell of lead, 4 pounds to the square foot.
Wow.
That was carefully soldered around the original.
So just wrapped around, you
Wrapped around, soldered and tapped into shape.
Oh, and sealed
completely. A completely sealed coffin. And then around that, as the ones that you see here would be the final cover, which is technically known as a casing. And then they were enabled to decorate that as they will. So it was quite a grand affair.
Very elegant.
Oh, very elegant.
How many people are buried down here?
About 3,000 altogether. There is space, however, for 4,000.
Oh, really? So if I wanted to book a space, I could have one?
Oh, certainly, yes.
How much would that cost me? Is it still 15 guineas?
Oh, no. Inflation has caught up with the catacomb trade. We are looking at £1,500 at least, minimum. That's for a single space.
A single space.
Yes.
And how about my coffin?
Now the real expense is in the coffin. You are looking at £4,000 to £5,000 for that style of coffin.
So it's quite expensive to die this way.
It is, yes. Very expensive.
Here in Kensal Green are buried 2 of our most famous engineers, and indeed 2 of my greatest heroes. Mark Isambard Brunel, who was a Frenchman who came here and built the first ever tunnel under the Thames, and his even more famous son, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who built railways, bridges, tunnels, all sorts of things. But at the time of the Crimean War, he was asked to design a folding flat-pack hospital to be shipped out to the Crimea, and he did it. Absolutely brilliant job. And he concentrated on light, ventilation and cleanliness.
The government had asked for Brunel's help because Florence Nightingale had found more soldiers were dying of diseases picked up in unhealthy hospitals than on the battlefields of the Crimea. The death rates in London hospitals were just as high, and Nightingale concluded this was the result of unsanitary conditions. She used her fame and political clout to transform hospital and ward design.
You can still see Florence Nightingale's principles at work in this modern ward. You can see where the beds would have been a long way apart. There's masses of light and space. The nurses' station is at one end of the ward, and above all there are masses of windows. She was mad keen about ventilation and lots of fresh air.
Florence Nightingale believed in the theory that disease was caused by a miasma, a stinking bad air filled with decomposed matter. This theory was disproved by the physician John Snow, who worked out that contaminated water supplies were responsible for diseases such as cholera. But for supporters of the miasma theory, to prevent disease, hospitals had to be clean and, above all, well ventilated. This 19th century style of ward became known as a Nightingale ward, and among its features were strange pillars along the centre of the room.
And this is one of those pillars. Although it's not really a pillar, it's a ventilation shaft made of iron. It's great for us because this is one of the old wards in St Thomas's which has been stripped for renovation. And that means that these shafts have been exposed, otherwise they'd be all covered up. They're listed now, so they're not going to take it away. Just looking at this ward, you can see how it must have been without all these partitions. A huge, wide room, very high, very spacious, very light, just as Florence would have liked it. Now they're putting in all these partitions to give the patients their privacy. Let me show you how that ventilation system worked. I've got here my own mini ward with all these beds down the sides, sunlight streaming in through the windows, and the 3 ventilation shafts up the middle, each one with a heater underneath so that there's hot air rising through them. Oh yeah, they're getting nice and warm now, so we should have a good through draft. Now over here, miasma of course is invisible, but I've got my own miasma production kit, or actually smoke production kit, which I'm going to put inside, and then the whole ward will fill up with smoke or miasma. There we are, that's going nicely. But you see, there's no way for fresh air to get in, so there's no smoke coming out of the top. They needed to keep the windows open, and that then would allow fresh air in, up through the ventilation shafts, taking all the miasma out of the ward. Now it's building up quite nicely inside now. They'll all be choking a bit with the miasma. Let me just open the window here. This is the only one that opens, and just watch the difference. Look, instantly, smoke pouring out of all 3 shafts here, absolutely belching out. It's also coming a bit out of the window, but it's belching out of these shafts because the hot air coming up there is pulling up all the smoke, all the miasma out of the ward, leaving those patients much happier.
The Nightingale wards at St Thomas's were housed in a pavilion plan building. The wards were isolated in their own individual blocks. Only 3 of the 6 original blocks remain today, but this was the single most important development in hospital design because of its emphasis on a sanitary environment. Even with these improvements, there was of course still a need to bury London's dead. In 1850, Parliament closed the crowded inner city graveyards, which led to greater pressure on the magnificent 7 cemeteries. A solution, of sorts, came with the opening of Brookwood Cemetery in 1854. It was a new cemetery for Londoners, but it was 25 miles away, in Woking. The London Necropolis Company even ran a train to transport London's dead to Brookwood from a private terminus near Waterloo Station. The mourning party travelled in a normal passenger train, and attached to these were special hearse carriages to carry the coffins. At 500 acres, Brookwood is the largest cemetery in Britain, and since it opened, some 235,000 people have been buried there. The funeral trains stopped running after the London terminus was bombed in 1941, but the entrance still remains on Westminster Bridge Road.
Even with Brookwood Cemetery open, there was concern in some quarters that burying people was taking valuable land from the living and giving it to the dead. Also, some people said that overcrowded graveyards were unsanitary and caused disease. These calls came from the campaigners for cremation, which was a bit of a shocking idea at the end of the 19th century. But despite the protests, London's first crematorium, which became very famous, was eventually opened here at Golders Green.
Nowadays, 70% of funerals are cremations. And crematoria also provide places to store the ashes.
This building here was the first columbarium in Britain. It was called a columbarium after the Latin word for dove, columba, and you can see why. All the walls have all these niches in with urns of ashes, and they look just like the pigeonholes in a dovecote. This chap here, in a rather bigger niche, is Sir Henry Thompson, and he was the chairman of the Cremation Society of Great Britain. For 30 years he campaigned for cremation. He said it would be cheaper, it would be more hygienic, it would avoid vandalism, and it would be wonderful if you spread the ashes on the ground because they're a great fertiliser.
Golders Green was the showcase for the cremation movement. Its architect, Ernest George, chose an Italianate style which fortunately camouflages the necessary but slightly off-putting furnace chimney.
The development and the acceptance of cremation here at Golders Green complete the circle of the London experience of death.
And for my final journey, I'd like to be cremated, just like a Bronze Age chieftain.
With its markets, docks and wealthy citizens, London's always been home to a large criminal underclass. And over the centuries, the authorities have tried all sorts of ways to hold back the tide of crime. Here, is one of London's most famous landmarks and its most infamous prison, the Tower of London. The Tower wasn't actually built as a prison to keep Londoners in, but as a fortress to keep them out. The first structure, the White Tower, was built by William the Conqueror to demonstrate his power and to intimidate the notoriously unruly Saxon Londoners. They would never have seen such a massive building. At 90 feet high and 118 feet wide, with walls 13 feet thick, it was at the time the second largest Norman tower in the world. Even though the tower wasn't built as a prison, people have been locked up here for more than 800 years.
From the 12th century to the 1820s, the Tower was the UK's principal state prison for religious and political prisoners.
This is Traitor's Gate, which was the way that many prisoners were brought into the Tower. Just imagine how scary it must have been. Brought down the river in a boat, and then the great tower looms up in front of you, and you know what's going to happen to you.
For many prisoners, the Tower was London's death row. Some were held for years before their executions on Tower Hill, attended by thousands of eager spectators. The Tower was used again briefly as a high-security state prison during both World Wars to hold enemy agents, the most famous of them being Rudolf Hess. But the Tower wasn't always so secure.
The first prisoner of all, in the year 1100, was a chap called Ranulph Flambard, who was Bishop of Durham, and they put him in the White Tower here for extortion. But he was a wily bird and he managed to escape. What he did was to throw a banquet for his guards, saying they were wonderful chaps, and when they were all drunk and asleep, he escaped down a rope that had been hidden in the wine casket, and down here were all his friends with horses, and they galloped off to France. Well, I guess they had to swim the last bit, but anyway, they escaped.
Contrary to legend, the Tower has never had a large prison dungeon filled with manacled inmates. In fact, most prisoners were kept in one of the smaller towers along the inner and outer curtain walls. They were held in varying degrees of comfort, depending on the status of the crime and of the prisoner. The celebrated courtier and explorer Sir Walter Raleigh spent 13 years in the Tower, condemned to death for allegedly plotting against James I.
This does not look like a prison cell, but as an aristocratic prisoner, Raleigh spent his longest stay at the Tower in this very room. He also had space for 3 servants. His wife and his eldest son came to visit him here, and his younger son was actually born in the Tower. He was allowed a lot of freedom of movement. He used to grow tobacco and other exotic plants on the lawn outside, and he did scientific experiments in a converted hen shed. He also did a lot of reading and a lot of writing. He wrote his biggest book in this very room.
For other prisoners, life wasn't quite as comfortable, but the Tower's fearsome reputation was surpassed by the horrors awaiting prisoners in jails for common criminals.
When I think of medieval prisons, I think of rat-infested dungeons. And one notorious prison in Southwark, the Clink, was exactly like that.
Built on the south side of the Thames, in an area full of theatres and brothels, for 700 years, the Clink was a place of terror for heretics, debtors and criminals arrested in the nearby streets. Up until the 19th century, prisoners had to pay for their own food and lodging, so those in the Clink starved in sickening filth. And along with these ghastly conditions, prisoners were also subjected to horrific punishments.
We talk these days about people being pilloried, which means ridiculed. Well, this is the pillory. It used to stand just outside the Clink, and it was used for minor offences. I'm stood on tiptoe and I can't move my head or my hands much. Well, it's a bit uncomfortable, but the fact is you were being exposed and ridiculed in front of the whole of London walking past. And what's more, people would chuck things at you. Rotten eggs, rats, dead cats, and sometimes stones. In fact, people even died in the pillory. Even if you weren't undergoing any of those horrible punishments, life in here was pretty unpleasant, partly because you were chained up all the time. On the hands you'd have manacles or handcuffs like this, and on your legs or feet you'd have these fetters, which are very, very heavy, great heavy chain. So even if you escaped, you wouldn't be able to run very much. And the noise in here must have been horrible. Screams from the whipping post or the pillory. And then for people wandering around, clank, clank, clank. In fact, it probably got its name, the clink, from this very clinking noise, which must have been absolutely continuous. And indeed, it became a generic name for all prisons, the clink. Locking people up in prisons depended on locks. And here is the original lock from Newham Jail. It's partly sprung like that, but it's also a deadlock because you can turn it like that. Isn't that a lovely noise? Let me show you round the back, and you'll see that there's a great clunking steel bolt here, which is going to prevent people from opening the door. And there's this very interesting key. It's a Bramah lock, invented by Joseph Bramah, who came from Yorkshire and started making these down here. And you'll see the key is actually like a cylinder with a lot of slots in it. And to open the lock, you have to push it in and push it against a spring and then turn it. And these locks were practically unpickable. Let me just show you how they worked. Here is my model Bramah lock. And I've straightened out that cylindrical key. So the key now, instead of having those slots round in a circle, actually has tines sticking up. But you see each one to a different extent. Now, let me show you the principle of the Bramah lock. Here is the bolt, which is holding the door shut, and it won't open because there are pins on the bolt which are running into these sliders. These are the sliders here. And what I need to do is to lift up each of those sliders to a different extent so those pins will go through the slots in the sliders. So I put the key into the lock and I turn it, and that's lifting these three sliders up differently until when I get there they're all neatly lined up and the bolt will then slide smoothly across. It's very, very clever, and it's because those slots are hidden way inside the mechanism that you can't see how to pick it.
Conditions in the prisons were terrible, but at least the inmates were still alive. By the 18th century, there were over 200 crimes for which you could be hanged. Some were as petty as theft of a handkerchief. At Tyburn, the site of London's most notorious gallows, over 50,000 people were executed.
I'm now apparently following the path of condemned men on their way from Newgate Prison to the gallows, and Lucy Moore, who's a historian, knows all about what actually happened. Lucy, we seem to be headed for Oxford Street, is that right?
We are heading to Oxford Street. In the 18th century, these would have been open fields, so we would have been riding through countryside.
Really? Just here?
Absolutely.
Oh, fantastic.
All the way along this road. Basically, the condemned men and women sometimes were taken from Newgate Prison to Tyburn, which is modern Marble Arch,
really?
where they were hanged. People would line the streets, and depending on whether the criminal was a sort of villain or a hero, people would either pelt them with stones and rotten fruit and things like that, or else girls dressed in white would throw bouquets into the cart for them.
Really?
It was a sort of hero worship thing. They were the celebrities of their day. The highwaymen, you know, were terribly handsome and dashing, the gentlemen of the road. 3/4 of the people who were killed at Tyburn were men between 20 and 30, so there was a sort of men cut down in their prime. I think that was what the sort of celebration aspect of it was about, was a way of sending them off. And so people would often buy them drinks all the way along, and they had the right to stop for a drink on the way. One for the road, that's where that comes from, and I think falling off the wagon.
So what did they drink?
You would have had a pint of sack.
A pint of sack. Look, driver, could you stop at the next pub? I'll have a pint of sack.
There were hangings at Tyburn for 600 years from the 12th century onwards. In the 16th century, in an attempt to speed things up, a new type of gallows was introduced, the Tyburn tree.
And they call it the Tyburn tree, but it wasn't really a tree, was it?
No, basically there was a triangular structure so that they could have 3 layers of people hanging. They had a cart underneath each of the sort of horizontal bars, and they would be the condemned men and women would be stood on the back of the cart with the noose round the neck, and the horses would be whipped, and the cart would drive off, and they would swing out. So from the beginning, you died of asphyxiation rather than your neck breaking. So it was a horrible, horrible death. They used to say you died of a sore neck and a wet pair of breeches. There's all sorts of nasty stuff going on. And criminals' friends might come up and try and tug on the legs to make the death more quick and therefore more painless. There's an instance of somebody who, after 15 minutes of hanging, was cut down and was still alive. He was known as Half-Hanged Smith. And he survived to live on afterwards. They let him on.
Oh, did they?
Yeah.
Oh, that was good. Were the crowds there?
Absolutely. There was sort of, well, sometimes people say there are 100,000 people there, but normally kind of 30,000.
Wow.
And there were special grandstands built. There were, which people could buy tickets for. There were...
like a football match?
Absolutely like a football match. People used to hire the top rooms of taverns so that they could get good views.
Well, we seem to be getting close now. I guess my time may have come. Well, it's been very nice knowing you, Lucy. Will you pull on my feet, please?
Yes, I certainly will.
Like any great city, London has its fair share of crime, and to cope with that, it needs a system of justice. You might find it hard to believe, but just a few yards away from noisy, bustling Fleet Street, there's a place full of peace, tranquility, and lawyers.
This is Middle Temple, one of 4 ancient societies of lawyers in London known as the Inns of Court. The inns were founded way back in the Middle Ages. In the 12th century, Henry II, faced with increasing feudal violence, sent his court around the country to settle disputes. Monks and priests were employed as scribes, as they were almost the only people who could read and write. Their advice was often asked for, and they were, in effect, the first lawyers. When the court resettled in London, the lawyers took up residence in the Inns of Court, and today this is where students train to become barristers.
Judges and barristers are instantly recognisable by their wigs and gowns, so I've come to a chap who actually supplies them. Trevor, could you dress me up as a barrister?
Without a problem.
Right.
All I need is measurements.
All right, 46 chest?
No, I don't even need that. All I want to know is how it drops at the back. Fits on the bottom of your calf, right, I'm there, 50. And if I can just check your head size.
Very fat is the answer to my head. Swollen, some would say.
Right, 62 centimetres.
62 the head.
62, and we drop at a 50. You'd just like to slide your arms in.
Arm in there, arm in there.
You'll find it just sits there like that.
That's very comfortable.
No buttons.
And the wig is 62. What's it made of?
This one's made of horsehair. Come from Australia.
Why do they wear wigs?
When Charles II came back from France, he came back, and wigs were very fashionable in France. And so the whole court would have adopted wigs, because they would all have wished to have been the same. And when you're like me and you're going slightly thin, it definitely adds something.
And is there anything special about the gown?
Yes, there is. On the back, which you may not have noticed, is current to all gowns, is a pocket. It looks like a little fish.
Right.
And in the bottom of it is stitched a little tiny piece there.
Right.
All the money would have been in coinage. And when you'd finished making your opinions, I, as a client, would wish to pay you. So I would pay you, and I'd put the money into the slip.
Ah, so I never had to put my hands out.
Well, correct. And we think that's where our backhander came from.
Oh, what a wonderful story. And that's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed.
I'm not sure my learned friends would agree with that story, but now I'm dressed for the part, I'll pay a visit to the most important courts in the land, the Royal Courts of Justice. The Royal Courts are home to the High Court and the Court of Appeal, which hears both civil and criminal cases. This is one of London's great Victorian buildings and was opened in 1882. It was the largest public building project since the Houses of Parliament, and its architect was George Edmund Street.
Street had won a competition to design the building, and as this sole architect and a stickler for detail, he was responsible for every single thing, from the foundations to the spires, from the carved pillars to the intricate mosaic floors. It exhausted him building this place, and in fact he died before it was finished. Parliament bought a 7.5-acre site for the new courts, and they had to clear 450 houses just to make space for the new building, which gives you some idea of how big it is.
The building is so enormous that an incredible 3 miles of corridors are needed to connect the original 18 courts.
I'm in the dock of Court Number 4, the Court of the Lord Chief Justice. Street actually asked a variety of architects to design all the courts slightly differently, so they have different sorts of carvings and different sorts of canopies and so on. Here we have a fabulous carving of the coat of arms, which comes from the original Court of Justice in Westminster Hall. And this is where the judge sits, high above the rest of the court. The Victorians loved their pecking order. And the court itself is immensely high. Just look at that roof.
The royal courts are renowned for the beautifully detailed stonework, but there's one section that wasn't part of Street's plan.
During the construction, the British stonemasons went on strike. So Street had to draft in a whole lot of foreigners to get on with the job. This led to some rather curious results. If you see here is a nice double pillar, smooth and elegant and with no features on it. But those foreigners met with terrible hostility, so much so they had to be housed and fed within the building. And they had to do something to while away their time, so they got on with the work, which they loved. And they began carving beautiful patterns into the pillars. Look at this. Isn't that wonderful? Until Street found out and said, hey, that's not in the plan, stop at once.
The Royal Courts of Justice took 8 years to complete and remain a suitably impressive testament to centuries of law and order. When the Royal Courts were built, London had been enduring increasing levels of crime and had to deal with more offenders than ever before. Australia would no longer take our convicts, so Britain had to embark on a massive prison building project.
One of those new prisons is behind me. Built in 1851, it was originally called the Surrey House of Correction and had 700 prisoners in individual cells.
It's now HMP Wandsworth. It has more than 1,400 prisoners. It's the largest prison in London and one of the biggest in Western Europe. Many Victorian prisons were based on the panopticon design, which meant prisoners could be observed at all times. Wandsworth has 2 buildings with radiating wings from a central tower. Inside the wings are open galleried landings, which enable the prison to be run on the separate system.
I'm now inside Wandsworth Prison, in fact, in the smaller of the 2 buildings, which was originally the women's prison. And the architecture is very obvious. There are 3 wings here, and you can see all the way down all of them from the central point. And the chap who really knows about Wandsworth is Stuart McLaughlin, who is a historian and a prison officer. Is that right?
That's right, Adam.
Fantastic. Tell me about the separate system. What is it?
The separate system was something that Britain inherited from America, largely from the Haviland State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, where it was deemed that the best way to rehabilitate people was to keep criminals isolated from each other and have a purpose-built building for that effect. There were some theories in the 19th century that crime was a disease that could be caught as easily as
mumps,
typhoid, cholera, you name it. So if you isolated each individual person, then there's less chance of contamination.
So to keep all the prisoners separate then, always in solitary confinement, yes?
Always in solitary confinement, 1 prisoner per cell only.
Right. And communication?
Would simply be no talking whatsoever. It was silent and separate. So no communicating. Even the warders at the time couldn't communicate with prisoners beyond simple instructions to get the job done. And the isolation system also got to the level that complete lack of identity for the prisoner beyond their prison number.
How?
So they would wear their prison uniform, and then on leaving a cell, they would have to wear a mask.
Really?
They would have to cover their faces, and that included female prisoners who were required to wear a veil.
Were they sentenced to hard labour? I mean, did they crack rocks?
In the London prisons, hard labour in terms of rock breaking couldn't take place. We've got no stone quarries.
Right.
So, again, Victorian ingenuity came up with a hard labour machine. which was a large box with a series of gears connected to a hand crank, which meant that the prisoner, if sentenced to hard labour, which was a court sentence, would have to turn so many revolutions on the hand crank machine.
So it was just a handle?
It was a handle, and it also had a counter which showed so many revolutions that you were meant to do by lunchtime and by supper time. The hard labour machine could have resistance on the gears, easier or harder, depending on the stature or the age of the prisoner. So that would be the job of the warder, to turn a screw, and that's where the term screw comes from.
Oh, I see. And it didn't do anything, this cranking?
It was a totally valueless machine, other than that the prisoner built up a sweat and got tired through its use.
Right. I'm inside one of the cells at Wandsworth now. One of the sorts of hard labour that prisoners had to do here, and indeed all over the country, was picking oakum. And they'd get a bit of tarry old rope from the Navy, and first they'd untangle the main strands like this, and then they'd take one of those strands and pull all the smaller strands apart, and then they would actually pull the fibres out from the strands. Now, this bit of rope isn't very old and it isn't very tarry, but you can imagine that with a very old tarry bit, this would be extremely hard work. In fact, it's quite hard work on my skin now. And once they'd separated all the fibres, they could then take the loose fibres and use them to stuff mattresses, or indeed, mixed with more tar, to stuff into the holes in ships. And when they sold this stuff, they really were getting money for old rope. Now, I better pick a bit more or I won't get any lunch. Wandsworth Prison is slightly reminiscent of the Tower of London, which used to loom intimidatingly above the medieval city, keeping people on the right side of the law. This grim building reminds us all today that, in the end, crime doesn't pay.
In the City of London today, ancient churches nestle alongside cutting-edge skyscrapers. This is the oldest part of our capital, but it's also a thriving modern financial district. How did it come to be like this?
The city has been the centre of trade since the earliest times, and this was so important that during the Middle Ages, the king gave it the right to run its own affairs. This combination of wealth and power was to have an enormous impact on the way the city developed.
Built in the 1400s, the Guildhall was the political and economic heart of medieval London. The name comes from the Anglo-Saxon word guild, which means payment, so citizens would probably have come here to pay their taxes. It was also the meeting place for the men that ran the city. They were businessmen, drawn from the trade guilds or livery companies. There was one for every type of trade within the city, and you can still see from the street names where each one was based.
Here inside the Guildhall are displayed the coats of arms and the banners of the 12 great livery companies. They have a strict order of precedence, and this has caused some fierce arguments, especially between the skinners and the merchant tailors. The skinners' banner is right opposite me there, and the merchant tailors up above me here. Eventually, they agreed to alternate between number 6 and number 7, and that's said to be the origin of the phrase at 6s and 7s.
The guilds were responsible for quality control in their trades, the medieval equivalent of trading standards. At the Guildhall, they kept official standards of weight, volume and length so that you could check you weren't selling customers short.
Here, set firmly into the wall, are a set of standard measures: 1 foot, 2 feet, and the imperial yard. This was set here after Parliament defined the imperial yard in 1824. It was really important for the guilds to get their weights and measures right, and there were severe penalties if anyone tried to cheat. For example, if a baker undersold a customer, he was liable to be hauled around the city with the offending loaf tied round his neck. So very often the bakers would chuck in an extra loaf when he had made a dozen to give you 13 for the baker's dozen.
The Guildhall has taken a bit of a battering over the years, and the roof has been replaced several times.
When it was bombed in the Second World War, they decided to replace it with Collie Weston slate. Now, this isn't normal slate at all. This is actually slices of limestone coming from a special quarry in Northamptonshire. And what they do is they dig lumps of rock out of quarries, out of the ground, and they leave them out in freezing weather so that the frost gets in and starts them splitting. I met David Ellis, who's been a slater for 54 years, to show me how it's done. And so this one's been out in the frost?
Yes.
Could I have a go at splitting it?
You can. There's a little tiny piece there, look, that's very thin and it's got nicely frosted away. That section there.
Oh, hey!
Look at that.
You haven't taken... That's just fallen off?
Well, that's just as it came.
So the water's got in, and the frost has simply pushed that slice off?
That's right, yeah.
David made me his apprentice for the day, and I set about making my first slate.
Go on, nice and sharp. That's it. Nice and gentle, and shoving the little wedge pieces into the joint.
Ah, so I'm not trying to split it.
You're not forcing it. You're just wedging it gradually apart.
Right. So very gently.
That's it.
5 minutes of training, even from a master, does not a slater make. But after rather a lot of chopping...
Look. Let me just give a little tap.
Success!
There. Hey, I've made a slate.
No, you haven't made a slate yet.
Oh, haven't I?
No.
Oh.
Look at that lovely...
I've made a big slate.
Look at that, it's a lovely colour, isn't it?
Right.
Now, what we do...
Yeah.
We get the largest slate we can out of that piece of stone.
Right.
Because we don't want to waste it.
No, obviously. Right.
It doesn't matter what length it's going to be. It doesn't matter what width. It's just we want the biggest piece of slate we can find.
I decided my apprenticeship was over and left the shaping of the tile to the expert, who made it look easy.
Nice strong wrist. So how are we doing now?
So the slates above are going to go there, and only this bit, only about a third of that slate's going to be visible.
That's it.
So if you look at the roof, in fact, there's 3 times as much slate on that roof as we can see.
Yes.
There's been a civic hall here for at least 700 years, but in fact, this has been an important site for much longer than that. You see the black circle, all that black stone all the way around, that marks the boundary of Roman Londinium's amphitheater. The remains are right underneath my feet, and I'm going down to have a look.
By the early 2nd century, Londinium was famous for its wealth of traders, and it was about then that this stone amphitheatre was built. This was an important place for Roman Londoners. They would have come here for big meetings, as well as animal fights, executions, and even gladiatorial combats. Blood was considered great entertainment. This place sat around 6,000 spectators. That's more than the Royal Albert Hall, and a good proportion of the entire population of Londinium at the time.
Hang on a sec, chaps. Before you kill yourselves, that looks very hard work to me. Now tell me, who were the gladiators?
Initially prisoners of war, and then sometimes wealthy thrill seekers, and sometimes people did it to pay off their debts. Or not.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay. So if you won, you got the money, and if you lost, nobody cared much.
Exactly,
because you weren't there anymore.
Exactly.
Oh, that's quite a good idea. Well,
certainly is.
Fairly good idea, yes.
Yeah, on principle, yeah.
So what sort of gladiator are you?
I'm a secutor gladiator.
A secutor?
And a pursuer or chaser.
Right.
And this is a secutor helmet.
Right.
Smooth.
Guy, it weighs a ton.
It does, yeah. The average weight, they reckon, of the gladiatorial helmet is 2 to 3 times heavier than the average Roman soldier's helmet. But you're not meant to be out there for very long.
Oh, I see. And the sword, you have a lot of slashing, yeah.
A lot of hacking and slashing blows, because a modern audience expects to see a little bit of that. But we think, from the sparse evidence we do have, that thrusting blows are much more common.
Ah, so it was all this?
Much more thrusting blows.
Okay,
yeah.
And none of this stuff at all?
Probably occasionally, but much more in the way of thrusting blows. Yeah.
So, suppose you were fighting like this, would it necessarily have been a fight to the death?
Not always. An experienced gladiator would be quite expensive. We know that some gladiators were stitched up by surgeons, and but some gladiators obviously had to face the inevitability that they would die. But We also know that people were just sent into the arena to die. They were butchered in the morning. It was almost like a warm-up act.
Horrible thought.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, with luck, one of you might stay alive. At least one of you might stay alive today.
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I have to drive home to Basel, and so...
well, yeah, you wouldn't do that very well dead, would you?
No.
Oh, well, good luck.
Thank you very much.
I hope you survive.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, carry on, chaps.
Thank you.
With all that blood being spilt in the arena, and of course the London rain, there was a lot of liquid to get rid of, and the Romans built an extensive array of drains to take it away. And the extraordinary thing is they're still here. Look here. Do you see this wooden pipe, a square section wooden pipe with part of the lid still on, to take all that horrible liquid away from the arena, preserved after 1800 years? It's really amazing. It's very, very rare to find these things lasting that long. And of course, there was an additional problem. It would have carried with it, the liquid, a lot of sand, a lot of rubbish, a lot of the stuff that the spectators would have chucked into the arena. And all that might have clogged up the drains. So they built this. Look, it's a silt trap. All the liquid would have come down the pipe on that side, the solids will have fallen to the bottom, and the clean liquid would have carried on down the drain this way. And then, maybe once a month, they would have sent a slave down with a shovel and a bucket to clear out the silt, and Bob's your uncle. Or, I don't know what Latin for uncle is.
The Romans built the wall around London that defined the shape of the city. The actual street plan within the walls hasn't changed much since medieval times and is often blamed for traffic problems today. But actually, things were no better back in the 16th century. All the vehicles carrying goods on these narrow streets made congestion a big problem, and it wasn't helped by the disorder and rude behaviour of the cart drivers. It was vital for the economy of the city that goods could be transported to and from the docks and the markets, so in 1517 they decided to form a carmen's guild to regulate the trade. In order to have your cart on the street, you would have to bring it to the guild hall to be marked. That was the first form of vehicle licensing.
The cart marking ceremony is carried out to this very day. I'm sitting in the queue. It's for vehicles that can carry goods or passengers, and I brought my recumbent along to be licensed.
Every carman has a numbered wooden plaque branded with the city arms. Each year, a new letter representing the current year is added to the plaque. The brand would allow the carman to ply for hire in one of the City of London's car rooms, which were the origins of our modern taxi ranks. None of the vehicles here today will be plying for trade, as the last car rooms in the city were abolished in 1965. But the cart marking tradition lives on in the form of this colourful ceremony.
Ouch. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
And there he is, complete with his little cart marking board hitched on the carrier at the back, and off he goes to make another delivery.
London is the financial capital of the world, and most of the activity takes place here in the square mile of the city.
The city has been a centre of business for centuries, and some of the old institutions, such as the livery companies, still have an important role to play.
The Goldsmiths Company is responsible for checking whether or not British coins are up to standard. They do that every year at a ceremony held here at Goldsmiths Hall.
The Queen's Remembrancer. It's called the Trial of the Picts and is overseen by a judge called the Queen's Remembrancer. This is the oldest judicial post in the country. The trial started in 1248, when the currency was hugely debased, and the king wanted to restore public confidence in the coinage that was issued by the mint and the government. Ever since, a sample of coins has been taken from each day's working at the Royal Mint. These are sent to Goldsmiths Hall in wooden boxes, otherwise known as the picks. There are 50 coins in each envelope. The jurors count the coins and pick one at random for further tests. A simple task, you might think, but this is a legal trial, so every aspect needs to be taken very seriously. The coin samples are measured and weighed and then taken away to be assayed or analysed chemically to see exactly what they're made of. Today, the jury gave a verdict of satisfactory, so you can spend your coins with confidence for yet another year. The goldsmiths were the first bankers. Depositing and lending coins developed naturally out of their business activities. But by the end of the 17th century, it became clear that we needed a national bank, and this was founded in 1694.
And here I am, inside the Bank of England. This is the oldest and grandest part of the bank, the parlours. This, the courtroom, dates back to 1774. It's where the governing body of the bank used to meet and make important decisions. Indeed, they still do to this very day. And what I really love about this room is that among all the gildings and mouldings and chandeliers, there, up above the arch, is a wind dial. You see the arrow points roughly to south. That means the wind is blowing from the south. The critical thing was whether sailing ships could sail up the Thames. Well, with a southerly wind, they'd be all right. They'd be on a broad reach most of the way. And that would affect commodity prices and interest rates. It was an early market information system. Wonderful.
As the bank's business grew, its building had to grow too. Sir John Soane was the first architect to face the challenge of housing a large commercial concern. Instead of building upwards, as we do today, he built out, eventually covering a site of 3.5 acres.
Round the whole thing, he built this curtain wall, and for maximum security, he built it with no windows at all, which meant that inside everything had to be lit with skylights, and it's a bit gloomy, all the staff complained. But the fact is that this curtain wall did its job. Nobody has ever climbed into the building over it, which is why we can say that things are as safe as the Bank of England. Although there is a story that somebody did get in from below. It was about 1836, and the directors had an anonymous letter from a man who offered to meet them in the bullion vaults whenever they liked. Well, at first they thought it was rubbish, but eventually they were persuaded to go down there one evening. And they were waiting for just a few minutes when they heard a noise and a chap popped up through the floorboards. He was a sewer man, and he discovered an old drain that ran directly underneath the floorboards. They were so impressed that he hadn't nicked all the gold that they rewarded him £800 for his honesty. I wonder if I could try something like that.
After the First World War, they decided the Soane Bank, mainly a single-storey building, just wasn't big enough to cope with the increasing numbers of staff. Everything within the curtain walls was demolished and rebuilt.
The new building went 3 floors down and 7 floors up. And if you look down this wonderful staircase, I hate heights. You can see at the bottom there's a bit of Roman tiled pavement. It's another reminder of the wonderful history of the city. This staircase itself is fascinating. If you look underneath, you'll see there's nothing holding it up. It's just stuck into the wall. I get quite worried walking down these, thinking the whole thing's going to collapse. It's said to be the longest cantilevered staircase in Europe, and Sam Price here is going to explain to me how it works. So, Sam, you've got your own.
We have. This is a model of a staircase at Hampton Court.
Right.
And if I stick a tread in here, like that, you can see it's quite floppy.
Oh, it's very wobbly.
Very wobbly.
So is this a true cantilever?
So this is how a true cantilever would work, but it can't.
Right, because the wall
is not strong enough in that direction to carry the cantilever.
Right, so I wouldn't want to walk on that.
So you definitely wouldn't want to walk on that.
Okay, so how does this stay up then?
Well, now this stays up by each tread sitting on the one below. So this tread sits on this tread.
Right.
The weight of this tread is on the back of that tread.
Right, so my weight here goes through this, down onto that one.
Onto the back of that one.
Yes.
Which this tread is supported under its front edge by this tread. So if the wall can stop this tread from twisting, the load will just come down the staircase. That's how it works.
Do other people get nervous on these staircases?
I think people only get nervous when you tell them that they're normally only built 4 inches into the wall. The Georgian and Victorian ones go in 4 inches.
Wow.
That's all.
That's terrifying.
And then people panic, and building inspectors say this isn't all right. So you have to explain that they've been there for 300 years, and they are all right.
So you think it's safe for me to go on?
I think you'll be all right.
Thank you very much indeed.
The Bank of England was part of a widening financial system in the city. The Corporation of Lloyds started out as a coffee house in 1688. Frequented mostly by ship owners, Lloyds began to expand into the financial world, arranging marine insurance for its patrons. It's had various homes over the years, but since 1986, Lloyds of London has occupied this striking building at No. 1 Lime Street.
During every hour, they do about £1 million worth of business. It's quite scary, really. In the middle of the room, there's a sort of throne, and the chap sitting there is called the waiter. That's from the coffee house days. And his job is to pass messages on a sort of tannoy system to the brokers. Above his head, you'll see there's a ship's bell. That's the Lutine bell from HMS Lutine, a ship that sank in 1799 with a cargo of gold and silver bullion. It was insured for £1 million with Lloyd's underwriters, and they paid the claim in full. Traditionally now, the bell is rung once for bad news and twice for good news.
The building was designed by the Richard Rogers Partnership, who had also designed the rather unorthodox Pompidou Centre in Paris. You might imagine that a 340-year-old institution like Lloyd's would want a conservative and traditional building, but instead they asked for something that would be distinctive and would look to the future. I spoke to one of the architects, Mike Davis.
How important is it to companies to build iconic buildings?
I think it's important. Remember, Lloyd's isn't one company, it's an umbrella for 60 or 70 trading companies, but nevertheless their world prestige and status is such they need an iconic building, and they actually said to us, part of their original brief was that we want a building which will put us in the forefront of world insurance in the 21st century. Specific brief to us.
Right.
So there you are. We want a building that's important, that's internationally recognised instantly and puts London right where it should be at the centre of the trading world.
What makes it so special?
Well, a lot of people would describe it as inside out. And the core of the traditional office building is in the middle, with the glazing around the edge here. All the technology is on the outside. Why? Because Lloyd said, we're traders. We don't want to stop trading. They're trading £1 million an hour in here. The last thing we want is men in white coats fixing services in the middle of our building. We want all that sort of stuff elsewhere so they can keep trading. So there's an oasis of calm. You can strip out a complete tower, replace it totally, change all its services, all its wiring, everything, without closing the room for 1 minute. You can't do that with a traditional building.
But noise must be a problem. You've got this noisy escalator.
Lloyd said you must match the same atmosphere and feel of the old trading market in the new trading market. That was part of our design brief. So we had to design this room and its acoustic finishes and its noise level so that it reaches 68 dB, which is exactly the level at which you can have a conversation that's private in a big public place, because after all, you're trading ships competitively one against another. You don't want the next guy to overhear you.
I see, so you need a bit of noise, but
you need enough noise to trade discreetly.
As the number of people working in the square mile increases, we need to think of new, inventive ways of building on the limited space that's available. So we're going to see more and more developments like the Broadgate Tower, which is built over the railway lines at Liverpool Street Station.
From up here on the 34th floor of the Broadgate Tower, you get a fabulous view of the city. In the beginning, London was built for the merchants and the traders on the Thames, and the city has been run by business and finance ever since. From the earliest guild halls to the modern, wonderful skyscrapers, the skyline of the city has been dominated by the desire of big businesses to build bigger and better buildings than their rivals, and that desire is going to continue for many years to come. This is a city of music. From Handel to Hendrix, from punk rock to the Proms, London is alive with musical legends. But where did the music come from, and where is it performed?
Today, London's venues are famous around the world. You can catch a classical concert at the Albert Hall, get down at a gig at Wembley Arena, and see a huge range of musical acts at any number of venues in between. Whatever you want, you'll find it here. But until the end of the 17th century, there weren't really any dedicated music venues in the city. The main place to hear music would have been in churches.
This is the crypt of St Mary le Bow in the City of London. It's an arched crypt, and in fact it's the oldest arched crypt found in any church in London. It dates back to the 11th century. It was in surroundings like this that medieval Londoners listened to music, although of course in those days the music was designed to glorify God and not to entertain the audience.
Plainsong is the earliest known music of the Christian Church. It was usually chanted one note at a time, perhaps because the huge echoing walls of the church might have made any more complicated arrangements more cacophonous than solemn and godly. The chants of priests and monks would have been a common sound emanating from London's churches and abbeys. However, as Plainsong was sung mostly in Latin, it's unlikely that much meaning ever got through to the common folk of the city. Secular music was considered ungodly by stricter clerics. This kind of singing was thought to incite lustful behaviour, especially when combined with dance. There is no doubt that music outside the church, focusing on love, political satire, dance and drama, were popular, but it wasn't until 1672 that London's first documented public concert took place at Whitefriars Music School near Fleet Street. After that, the idea of going somewhere just to hear music really began to catch on. Back then, a musical performance was a very different affair from what we might expect today, as were some of the instruments they used.
I'm in the Museum of the Royal College of Music, and I'm with Jenny Nex, and you're curator of instruments.
That's right.
That means you say you know all about these weird things you've got here.
I know something about some of them. We have about 800 objects in the collection, so there's a lot of things to know about.
Hang on a sec, is that an instrument or a mistake?
This example here is a serpent. Now you can tell from the shape, perhaps, why it got its name.
Yes. Dating back to the 16th century, the serpent was originally used to accompany chanting monks. Later it was used in military bands for a part that is nowadays played by the tuba.
Well, I think maybe I need a little practice.
I think so. It's a very difficult instrument to play. Handel wasn't very keen on it. He said, this certainly isn't the serpent that seduced Eve.
No, I think I'd believe it. So when did music really take off in this country?
In London, the first concerts, as you know, were towards the end of the 17th century, and throughout the 18th century, the popularity and the number of things you could do in London gradually increased till the end of the century, the 1780s and 90s, when there was a huge amount going on.
So what's all this stuff?
Well, you can see here we have a picture of what went on at Bagnigge Wells, which was a pleasure garden in Islington. Everyone's dressed up to go out.
They really are amazing. I mean, even the blokes have wonderful hats, and the women, well, it's way over the top. Gosh.
Other things that went on were things like the concert series. This is a ticket from the Concert of Ancient Music. You can see this one, 1795. The ancient music concerts were celebrating music that was older than 20 years. So most of us are a bit over the hill.
Yes.
And we have also the programme book from 1795, the word book, where you get lists of the different concerts. You can see there that it's mostly Handel for this one. And then you get all the words that are going to be sung by the singers.
So you could sing along?
You probably wouldn't sing along. You might talk through it all. I think concerts weren't the quiet occasions that we expect of people today.
And then the sheet music. That meant that people could read music, of course, which was quite complicated.
Indeed. Well, in the domestic spheres, the young ladies would very much be playing the keyboard instruments, things like the harpsichord and the piano.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is a harpsichord. And there is a young lady poised. Bridget, what can you play for us?
I can play an arrangement of one of Handel's arias called Lascio Ch'io Pianga from his opera Rinaldo. And this was arranged and actually published in the 18th century in a collection called The Ladies' Entertainment, or The Ladies' Banquet, designed for ladies to play at home.
Good, but I'm allowed to listen, am I? As a non-lady. OK, take it away.
Gradually, more and more people wanted to buy their own instruments, and more manufacturers set up shop in the city. If you couldn't find space for a harpsichord in your parlour, there were plenty of central London shops where you could find something a little smaller. A gentleman, like myself, might have gone for the slightly less cumbersome violin, an instrument which, unlike many, hasn't changed in design over the last 300 years.
One person who really knows about violins is Mark Robinson. Mark, what's this instrument?
This is a Stradivari from 1691, worth in the region of $3 million.
$3 million?
Yes.
Wow. Wow. They don't get more expensive than that, do they?
They do indeed, yes. A really, really perfect example of a Stradivari will be a lot more money than that.
Why are they so expensive? What's so special about them?
Really, it's the tradition. The fact is that they've been around for a long, long time. 300 years, it's a long proving ground. So they've actually lasted the course. They sound fantastic. They have wonderful varnish, wonderful ground, and really you can see the genius behind the making.
Mark works for Beers, a company that started selling violins in Wardour Street back in 1865. Demand grew, and founder John Beer decided to employ craftsmen to work in his own workshop. Most of the early instrument makers in London, like Beers, would have been based in the Soho area, as that's where the publishers and the theatres were, so it was a hub for musicians. Of course, now it's possible to mass-produce violins cheaply in factories. But for the right sound, Mark insists that traditional crafting by hand is the only way. A month of hard work goes into every violin, so I wonder how far I'll get today.
So, if I work for a month or two, will I wind up with a Strad?
You might end up with a violin.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome.
Cheers.
London's instrument makers were keen to demonstrate their craftsmanship. In 1901, piano makers Bechstein built a lavish auditorium next door to their workshop in Wigmore Street to showcase their wares. Wigmore Hall is still used today, and you can see that the stage appears to represent a rather charming parlour, so that you could imagine the same musical scene taking place in your very own home. But for some productions you need a venue on a slightly grander scale.
The Royal Opera House first opened in 1732, and the first opera by Handel was performed here in 1735. Unfortunately, it burnt down a couple of times, but this wonderful auditorium has survived for more than 100 years. It holds 2,200 people in wonderful red plush comfort. But what really stuns me is the backstage area. The whole lot was rebuilt in 1999, and it's huge. You can just see the stage itself goes back about 15 yards that way, and it's about 15 yards square, something like that. But behind it, there's acres and acres of space with more and more sets. It took me about 10 minutes to walk through them. It is truly fantastic.
The Royal Opera House is big enough to look after all aspects of any production. Within the building, there are rehearsal rooms and prop workshops, and they can even make and dye their own costumes. The huge space backstage can easily accommodate scenery construction, but if anything else is needed, delivery lorries can literally be driven into their very own lift and taken straight up to the scene dock.
I'm now behind the main stage at the Royal Opera House, and I'm with Jeff Wheel, who is technical director, is that right?
That's correct.
So you know how all the scenery moves about?
Yes, most of it, yes.
OK, so what... Oh, we're moving.
That's right.
What's happening?
What we're doing is the compensator. It's a big scissor lift. It's dropping down a foot.
Oh, it's only a foot?
Only a foot.
So I don't need to be scared of heights?
No. What will happen now is we have 2 wagons of scenery over there, so that's 32 tons of scenery.
That's a lot of scenery.
That's right.
That's a whole set, in fact.
That's a whole set indeed.
Right, and that can now move on, can it?
That's right. What will happen is there's some electric motors on the sides here.
Right.
They will rip the wagon and drive it into the gap that we've created.
The stages work a bit like a sliding block puzzle. You can move a block into any of the spaces so long as one is always left empty. This new system means that the Royal Opera House can, incredibly, make up to 8 full set changes a day, making it the busiest opera house in the world.
From the 18th century onwards, London had become a real haven for music lovers, with all sorts of public concerts and operas in many venues like this one, all the way round the West End. But this sort of entertainment was really only for the upper classes of society.
In the 1830s, a new type of musical culture began to emerge from London's saloon bars. It was a mixture of sing-alongs, comic songs, and snippets of opera and folk music. Very soon, purpose-built venues known as music halls began to open, offering entertainment aimed directly at the working classes.
You might find it hard to believe, but behind these peeling doors lies what was once called the handsomest room in town, which was in fact a pub with a music room at the back. But in the 1850s, a chap called John Wilton bought the adjoining properties and turned it into a huge venue, Wilton's Music Hall. And it is, in fact, the oldest surviving music hall in London. The interior is wonderful, but there are major structural problems, starting with the damp. In fact, it's the only place in England on the world list of endangered buildings. Wilton started as a music hall in 1859 and flourished for decades until there was a terrible fire, and after that it was used as a mission and a rag store. But now they're using it again and hoping to restore it. In the early days, they used to perform extracts from classical operas. In fact, the performers at the Royal Opera House, the moment the performance was ended, would leap into taxis and come down here, still in their costumes and makeup, and perform the same things on the stage here, which the elite thought was wonderful because it would educate the lower classes in the performing arts. I wonder what's on tonight.
For real performances, they would have used much bigger hydraulic-powered barrel organs, which were, I guess, the Victorian equivalent of the mobile disco.
Let me show you how it works. When I turn the handle, this barrel rotates. That's why it's called a barrel organ. And in the barrel, you'll see there are a whole lot of pins and staples. And as the barrel goes round, these pins and staples lift the little keys here, one by one. You can see them going up and then dropping again. This is, in fact, an early form of programming because there are 8 different tunes on this barrel, and all you have to do is move it along a bit and you get a different tune. It's very cunning. Now, when you turn the barrel and the keys go up and down, what they do is to move these levers here. And you'll see that they're going up and down as they're pushed by the keys. And what they do in turn is round here to move these bits of wood in and out, and they allow air to come out past the reeds from the bellows and make a noise. So if I give it a bit more welly to get the bellows going, ain't that bloomin' marvellous?
Despite attempts to educate those who came to the music halls with highbrow musical performance, what the lower classes really wanted was a good old-fashioned knees-up. It's rumoured that the very first British performance of the can-can took place at Wilton's before being promptly banned. London's music scene was booming, but surprisingly, many of the buildings that were planned for musical performance had been built without any knowledge of the science of acoustics. The very first concert hall in London to be designed with acoustics in mind was the Royal Festival Hall, built on the South Bank in 1951 for the Festival of Britain.
Here inside the auditorium, it is quite amazingly quiet. You could hear a pin drop, which is extraordinary because Waterloo Station is only a couple of 100 yards away. There's a busy road next door, there's the river with people walking along it, and there are people in the building, chatting, having coffee and so on. And the way they've done that is very clever. Have a look at this. Here outside the auditorium, I can still faintly hear the noisy world, the rumbling of the trains, rattling of cars, hooting of boats on the river. But mainly what I've got here is the buzz of people enjoying themselves, shopping, drinking coffee, chatting and so on. And the cunning thing is, even that has been cut out of the auditorium by building the auditorium in a separate box. Look, this is the outside wall, this is the underneath of the floor. So what they've done is to make the auditorium quiet by building a box within a box.
The concert hall sits right in the middle of the building, insulated from outside noise by specially designed sound-absorbent foyers, a series of double walls, and the double doors of the auditorium itself.
Another problem they had to cope with was reverberation. Just listen to that note. It goes on and on and on. And that's a bit like notes echoing off the walls of a room. I'm sure you've been in one of those cafes where all the surfaces are very hard and there's so much noise you can't hear yourself think, let alone speak. Well, what you need to do is to dampen out some of that echoing, some of that reverberation. Let me show you. This Perspex box is a model of my sitting room, and when I drop a drop of water into it, it's like a note going off in the middle of the room, and the water is there to show you how the sound waves work.
When a sound is produced in a room, it decays gradually as it's absorbed by the walls and the air. In larger reflective chambers like cathedrals or concert halls, the reverberation time, or the time it takes for the reflected sound to return to the listener, is longer. The mix of the original sound and its delayed echoes bouncing from the walls can be confusing for both the performer and the listener.
When they built the festival hall, they attacked the problem scientifically, and they followed a formula worked out by a chap called Wallace Sabine in the late 1800s. And he'd calculated the effect on the notes of the size of the room and the furnishings and what people were wearing and how many people were there and all that sort of stuff. And they used that to try and make this room sound natural, so that if you clapped, you'd just get a little bit of echo. You see, it doesn't go on and on, but you definitely hear it.
It worked well. Too well, in fact. The internal walls absorbed the sound completely, and there was no reverberation at all. Performers couldn't hear their colleagues on the other side of the stage, and concertgoers complained it was like listening to music through the wrong end of a telescope. The good news is that the hall's acoustics have recently been revamped. A clever new system allows fittings and panels in the hall to control the degree of reflection or absorption of sound. So the hall itself can now be changed to suit any style of music or performance. Nowadays, if you can't get to a venue to hear the live performance of a song, you can easily buy it on CD instead. But at one time, the only record of a song would be the sheet music itself.
Towards the end of the 19th century, sheet music sellers began to collect here in Denmark Street because it was on the edge of Soho, which meant the rents were cheap and it was a short walk to most of the theatres. Well, so many musicians gathered here that the shops began to sell instruments as well and provide recording space, studios. So it became known as London's Tin Pan Alley, and it was the heart and soul of the music industry. I'm now inside Regent Sounds with one of the pioneers of rock and roll, Marty Wilde. Marty, you were a great hero of mine. Teenager in Love came out when I was 16 and I was all a quiver, you know. Tell me, why is Denmark Street so important?
Well, for the last, I would say, the last 40 or 50 years, probably more, Almost every song that you've ever heard and the public have listened to really originated here somewhere or other, because even if it wasn't written in this vicinity of this street, then it was published in this street. It was a bit like Carnaby Street. It was a street that was inspirational. It was a buzzed place, particularly for me because nearby, just down the road, there was all the guitar shops. You could go and see new guitars, new amplification. But then, of course, on top of that, Denmark Street itself was the home of the publishers, and that's where you went to get your material, or you went to meet them, to befriend them, so they would send you a good song.
Ah, I see. I mean, this was a recording studio. Did you ever record anything here?
I did, probably round about where we are sitting now.
Did lots of artists come here?
Yeah, there were many people, many big names recorded here. As I say, I think Tom Jones as well. Tom did some early demo work here, yeah, I'm sure he did.
It's not exactly a big studio, is it?
No.
About 5 yards square.
No. It's a bit like the Sun recording studios in Memphis, you know, it's just one of those places that it sort of, and it still has a phenomenal personality. It still has, you can feel it after all these years.
Denmark Street's legacy is huge. The Rolling Stones recorded their first LP here. Elton John wrote Your Song here, and it's where the Sex Pistols laid down their first demos. London's rock heritage takes in some world-famous venues too, like the Marquee Club, where The Who and the Stones played some of their early gigs, the Roundhouse, where the British psychedelic scene was born, and the 100 Club, which began as a trad jazz venue and then went on to champion punk and new wave.
This is London's latest music venue, the much-maligned Millennium Dome, now rebranded the O2 Arena. With 23,000 seats, it's the biggest in London. And just looking at that and the recent upsurge in ticket sales for concerts just shows that music is alive and well in this great and vibrant city. I wonder who's playing tonight.
Hello, London!
Until 50 years ago, London was the centre of a vast shipping network with trade connections to ports right across the globe. Way back in Elizabethan times, sailors following the intrepid explorers Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh developed trade with Russia, the Americas and the East. And as a result, London became wealthy on a tide of sugar, spices and silk.
As a result, London was able to become a city of international stature and a centre for finance and shipping. Prosperity helped the city to grow, not just along the river with docks and warehouses, but in the financial heart. Places like the Royal Exchange and Lloyd's of London were built thanks to wealth generated by the port.
Both sides of the river were lined with warehouses holding all sorts of goods. Tobacco, alcohol and furs had to be declared to customs and the duty paid in the legal quays on the north side. All the ships waiting to be discharged stayed in the Pool of London between London Bridge and where Tower Bridge now is. But the trouble was that London was enormously successful, and so ships often had to wait here for weeks until their cargo could be discharged. In fact, the place got so crowded, it said you could walk from bank to bank of the river just by jumping from ship to ship. It must have been amazing.
This area may look respectable and law-abiding now, but in its day, Wapping and Ratcliffe were at the heart of a rather seedy sailor town. You can get a feel for what things would have been like down at the museum in Docklands.
The streets were probably a bit like this one. Dark, narrow, twisting, smelly, lined with pubs and brothels and the sort of shops that sell things that sailors want. Food, for example, and chandlers with ropes, that sort of stuff. And of course they were full of thieves and vagabonds and people ready to prey on drunken and unsuspecting sailors. In fact, I think maybe I better scarper before I get my wallet nicked. Just imagine dozens of ships anchored here for days, even for weeks, and laden with the most delectable goodies, an absolute magnet for rival gangs of criminals. The criminals who were caught were hanged at Execution Dock, just along here somewhere, and then their bodies would be placed in an iron cage against the wall and left there for 3 tides to wash over them as a warning to others. It didn't seem to do much good, though, because in 1797, a chap called Patrick Cahoon calculated that £500,000 worth of stuff was stolen every year. That's about, say, 40 million in today's values. So he and a group of ship owners campaigned for the construction of enclosed docks.
The Thames had been overcrowded for far too long. Enclosed docks had been needed in London for around 100 years, but the various companies of porters, lightermen and watermen who carried cargoes off vessels had always blocked any proposals for enclosed docks in order to protect their livelihoods. Rival ports like Liverpool, that had already modernised, were way ahead of London.
This is West India Dock, completed in 1802 on the open fields of the Isle of Dogs. And when it was finished, this huge warehouse was the largest brick building in the world. On this side is the Northern Import Dock. The ships would come in here to discharge their cargo, and when they'd done that, they went through to the Southern Export Dock over there to load up again for their next trip. The huge advance was that they didn't have to go and wait weeks and weeks in town to be checked by customs and excise. All the checks could be done here on the spot, which speeded up the whole process enormously until it wasn't long before they could get through 500 ships in the year.
The dock was open solely for the trade of the West India Merchants Company, who had cannily won a 21-year monopoly on catering to all ships carrying cargoes from the West Indies. The warehouses were soon full of sugar, rum, tobacco and coffee. Dockers who carried sacks of cane sugar ended up with badly scratched and bleeding backs from the coarse sugar. Bags were washed, hung out to dry and then reused. As a result, the area became known as Blood Alley. Barrels played a huge role in transporting all manner of liquids, but they needed constant maintenance and repair. This was the job of the dock coopers.
Now, John here, you're a cooper, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
Hogsheads, tons and puncheons, what are they?
Pipes, all cast, they're all wooden cast.
Different sizes of barrels?
Different sizes.
This is oak, yes? And then you've got iron hoops around it, which are just to hold all the staves together.
That's right. Yeah.
And this is called the head?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and what...
Yeah. Hammer and driver.
A driver?
Yeah.
Okay, show me what you're going to do. I'm going to stand back a bit, and then in a minute I'll ask whether I can have a go, but I want to see how you do it first. Well, that was easy enough.
That's it. Well, it's dried out, the timber.
Ah, I see, okay. So it ought to be damp, ought it? It's still a bit green or something.
In the vaults, all the cask of wine and spirit, the atmosphere's correct.
Right.
So it stays lovely and cool. And
right.
It's handsome for
right.
cask, you know. If you had a cask in the sun, even though if it had something in it, whiskey, it would start to drive out and leak. You'd see the staves, especially on the top, where it was laying down, where the sun's belting down.
Right.
Sometimes we've had ships, loads of sherry come from Spain, where the casks have been out in Spain on the quay, and when they've come over, they've been as slack as anything. And when they come off the ship, litres everywhere. There's the coopers running up. Where they've been out in the sun.
Yes.
For 3 or 4 days, you know.
Now, do you think I can do this one?
Yeah, cool.
Go on then.
Yeah.
So my hammer and my driver,
That's it.
and go under the...
That's it. Yeah.
Anywhere there?
Yeah, you got it.
It's not moving.
Yeah. Well, come round.
Oh yes, it is moving. It's just moving a bit. Yeah, you're ahead on it. Hey, I did something useful. Well, moderately useful. So you're actually pushing the staves out a bit.
That's right. To get the head out the groove.
Right. So now this would all fall apart if we hadn't got any hoops on.
That's right, yeah.
The wood of this barrel has dried out and the staves have become quite slack. It needs maintenance, so John is tightening up the iron bands before fixing them back into place.
Now, how do you show the customs man what's in it?
We have to knock the bung out.
How? Hang on a sec, it's jammed in there.
We use a wooden flogger.
A wooden flogger?
Yeah.
I'm standing well back.
Yeah. You've got to be very careful, because if you hit it a bit too hard, the stave could crack.
Hey, that's amazing. And you just wallop it and it pushes the bung out.
The customs men would take a sample of the liquid to verify what it was, and also used special gauging instruments to measure the dimensions of the barrel. Afterwards, the barrels would be resealed. A piece of sackcloth was placed over the hole before the bung was replaced to give a nice tight fit.
Did you ever have a taste of the contents?
You mean the liquid?
Yeah.
Well, can I say this? Liquid was one thing in the Port of London was flowing. That's the perks of the job, isn't it? I don't need to say no more, need I?
You don't need to say any more indeed.
Do I?
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Just like today, customs officers were sharp on scrutinising everything that came through the port, and they had all manner of devices for doing so.
When somebody imported loose cargo in sacks like this, the customs officers would want to make sure there wasn't any contraband hidden there, say a box of tobacco or a bottle of brandy or something like that. So he would produce his rummage stick and he would go, no, sorry, no brandy in there.
Soon, other companies started to get in on the act and built their own docks, complete with hard bargain for monopolies. Wine and brandy came into the London docks in Wapping. Timber from Scandinavia and the Baltic was unloaded at the Surrey commercial docks near Rotherhithe, while the East India docks in Blackwall catered for the trade in tea, spices and silks. There's not a lot left of the docks, but in some places there are still high walls like these, built to keep the thieves out and the goods safely locked away. Some walls were 50 feet high. They weren't taking any chances. The West India dock had a couple of hundred men patrolling the premises. The dock police lived close by in these rather nice cottages.
The men were pretty well armed. They had truncheons, they had cutlasses like this, and they had blunderbusses, so they could tackle practically anyone. Hey, you, come back here. Docks and warehouses were built all along both banks of the river, and there was fierce competition between the different companies. In order to get trade, they had to keep their prices down, and one result of that was that the dockers were very badly paid. It was nearly always casual work, and they had to work outside in every sort of weather. In fact, life as a docker must have been pretty tough. This is one of the dock gates, and it was just here that all the casual workers would come at 7:45 in the morning for the call-on to try and get a job, jostling, bustling for position, trying to get to the foreman's attention. At one time, there were 60,000 men working in the docks. It must have been an amazing sight. Ah, there you are. I've come here to the Royal Observatory at Greenwich to witness a rather curious thing. You see that red ball up there? It looks like a sort of lolly on a stick. But that was, in fact, the world's first accurate public timepiece, and it turned out to be absolutely vital for the shipping business. It doesn't look much like a clock, and in fact it tells the time only once every day. But this is how it works. At exactly 5 minutes to 1, the red ball goes halfway up the stick. At exactly 2 minutes to 1, it goes up to the top, and at the point of 1 o'clock, it comes down again. It's very, very simple. There it goes. It's on its way up to the very top, so that means it's exactly 2 minutes to 1. It can't be long now. Very close to 1 o'clock. There it goes. It's exactly 1 o'clock. Right, my watch is a minute and a half fast. Exactly 1 o'clock, the ball comes tumbling down. Isn't that a wonderful time signal? What was the point of the red ball? Well, you have to imagine the Pool of London, just upriver there, absolutely packed with sailing ships at anchor, waiting to sail out into the seven seas. But they don't know exactly what time it is. So at around 1 o'clock, they all train their telescopes on the red ball, and when it drops, they know it's exactly 1 o'clock. Then they can set their ship's clocks and know exactly when the next high tide was. But in fact, knowing the time was much more important than that for navigation. Suppose you're sailing around the world, like these chaps here, then you need to know how far east or west you are. That's your longitude, because otherwise you might crash into Africa. Well, I'm in Greenwich, which is here, and that's longitude 0, and suppose it's now noon, so home time is 12 noon. For these chaps out in the middle of the Atlantic, the time's going to be about 9 o'clock in the morning. But if they know that home time is 12 noon, then they know they're 3 hours behind Greenwich and therefore about 3,000 miles west. And the first chap to get a grip on home time and therefore longitude was John Harrison. Ah, Jonathan, what are you doing?
Hi, just winding one of the Harrison timekeepers.
So this is H3?
This one is H3, yes. One of this series of remarkable timekeepers by John Harrison, which of course ultimately solved the longitude problem.
And this was what, 1750?
This one was actually started in 1740 and finished just before 1760.
It's quite complicated. Like the earlier ones, he couldn't use a pendulum, could he? Because that wouldn't work at sea.
That's right, but it was, these large timekeepers were based on pendulum clocks. Harrison obviously had to decide first of all where he would start with his marine timekeepers, and he looked first at clocks and watches and decided which way to go. Watches at that time in the 1720s were hopelessly inaccurate things, but pendulum clocks were very accurate, so the logical thing to do was to start large. Obviously you can't take a pendulum to sea because it would just sort of crash around, so instead of a pendulum Harrison fitted oscillating balance wheels. This is in H3. In H1 and H2 they were balanced bars. They moved in antiphase, that is to say they were moving in opposite directions, and they were interlinked, which Harrison believed would make them so that they weren't affected by the motion of the ship.
Right, self-compensating.
Well, it wasn't strictly true, but that was his idea, and it worked to some extent.
Right. Were any of these tested at sea?
Number 1 was tested at sea. It was sent on an unofficial trial to Lisbon in Portugal, and on the way back it did rather well, and it actually got the ship out of trouble because they thought they were further away from land than they were, and Harrison said, no, H1 tells me we're actually in a dangerous position, and the master was highly impressed by this. So right from the beginning it began to prove its usefulness.
This wasn't the ultimate, was it?
Absolutely, because of course although it was 19 years, this was not what solved it. It was H4 that did the business.
This is H4, this is the ultimate, yes?
This is Harrison's 4th timekeeper, yes. We call it the Mona Lisa of watches. It's not only the first practical marine chronometer, this was the first of all precision watches.
So did this watch actually save lives?
What it led to certainly did, because this was the precursor of the modern marine chronometer, which went on to save thousands of lives and millions of tons of valuable cargo, certainly.
So this must be, well, the most important watch ever made.
I think it certainly counts for that, absolutely.
Harrison's invention was a hugely important breakthrough for navigation. The danger of running aground was reduced, but life at sea was still a dangerous business.
It's hard to imagine, but a couple of hundred years ago, the whole river here would have been heaving with ships. And of course, every now and then people fell off and drowned. And so they needed lifeboats. Now, the chap who really knows about lifeboats is Simon Stevens here, who's curator of
the Ship Model and Boat Collection at the National Maritime Museum.
OK, so you know everything.
Well,
when did they start thinking about lifeboats?
Well, the idea came about in the late 18th century because there was a huge loss of life off of the coasts around the UK within spitting distance of the land, and people on the land were getting so frustrated that they couldn't rescue these poor souls, so they got together to form life-saving communities or societies for which they needed life-saving or lifeboats to do their work.
Right. Who actually invented the lifeboat?
The idea of making a boat sufficiently buoyant to be able to save life had been around since about 1785. For instance, there was a chap called Lionel Lukin, who was a London coach builder by trade at Longacre. He actually added buoyancy cases to a boat to make it unemergible, as he called it.
Now, Simon, I brought along my own lifeboat here.
Yeah.
Tell me about the important features of it.
Right. The most important features of the lifeboat at this date are these end air cases, bow and stern. These have got to be sealed units so that the air can't rush out, and they're full of buoyant materials such as cork.
Okay.
Now, the whole idea of these end cases is that when the boat is upset, it raises the boat and makes it unstable in the water.
Ah.
Now, you'll notice here also that there's some heavy metal objects inside
ballast
the hull.
At the bottom.
Exactly. And this would have been on the outside or the underside of the keel, so that when the boat was upturned...
So if it goes up that way...
It would make it completely unstable.
Then it's going to be very unstable and it'll swing back again.
And it should swing back.
So it should be self-righting. Do you predict, when I put this in the water, is it going to float?
It looks to me like it will float, certainly.
This is a tense moment. 1, 2, 3... Ah! It's floating.
It's floating. Now, every time a lifeboat was built, they had to do these tests. The RLNI insisted that buoyancy tests were done so that the boat floated.
On every boat?
On every boat, and that they were self-righted as well. That was self-righting principle.
Where did they do the tests?
They did them on the Thames.
Right here in the river?
On the yards that built them, absolutely.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
OK, so now you're saying if I turn it over, it's going to turn itself up the right way up again?
In theory, it should do, yes.
OK, so now I'm going to turn her right over.
Now, she's now resting on those air cases, which is lifting the whole of the hull up.
Right.
And the ballast is high, making the whole of the hull unstable.
So you reckon she'll turn herself the right way up?
Well, yes, I think it will. There you go.
Ah!
Look at that.
That is...
Bingo.
That's very impressive. I'm just going to do that again to prove there was no trick, nothing up my sleeve. I'm going to turn it the wrong way up. OK, 1, 2, 3, go.
There we are.
That's very impressive.
See?
So it's the combination then of the high-up air tanks here and the heavy ballast
on the underside of the keel, down below.
The keel.
So when it's overturned, it's completely unstable. And you can imagine this in a rough sea. It just wouldn't stay up the wrong way for very long at all.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. That's wonderful.
Pleasure.
At one time, up to 90% of Britain's lifeboats were made in London stockyards. And to this day, all lifeboats have to follow this self-righting principle. As vessels got bigger and steamships slowly took over, the old upriver docks were too small and trade moved further downstream. There's not a lot left of the old docks now. However, there is one company that is still bringing in cargo up the Thames.
Here on the marshes of East London in the late 1800s, 2 sugar refineries were opened. One by a grocer called Henry Tate, and the other by a cooper and shipowner called Adam Lyle. By 1921, the 2 companies had merged to form Tate and Lyle, and they're still here at Silvertown. What's more, they still bring in the raw sugar by ship up the Thames and unload direct into the refinery. This is how the raw sugar arrives on the banks of the Thames. It's just loose in the holds of the ship. This is the Doxer, and she's come from Jamaica. And she carried originally 24,000 tonnes of raw sugar. And it's picked out of the holds, look, with a grab, chunk by chunk, until they've taken all 24,000 tonnes. It's going to take 5 days to unload the whole ship. And the grab goes over and tips the whole lot into that hopper. And from the hopper, it goes down onto this conveyor belt, and here you see the raw sugar going straight into the factory to be refined. This is their sugar mountain. This place holds nearly 70,000 tonnes of raw sugar, and at the moment there's, well, maybe nearly 20,000 tonnes in there. Henry Tate made a pile of money out of sugar, and he used it to found a National Gallery of British Art, which was actually his own contemporary collection. He put it in a new building on the site of an old prison on Millbank, and it's now called the Tate Gallery. Everything changed when containers came along, because the container ships were so massive they simply couldn't fit in the docks upstream. So the whole port effectively moved downstream to Tilbury and Gravesend. Meanwhile, old warehouses have been revamped and turned into posh apartments. The docks have become marinas, and Canary Wharf, which is where we used to unload fruit and veg from the Canary Islands, is now nothing to do with that anymore. It's become the home of high finance and banks.
From the earliest times, London has been the literary centre of Britain. Books, plays, papers and journals have all come forth from the presses and publishers of the city. Londoners have a voracious appetite for news and the written word. That thirst for knowledge has helped drive the publishing industries and made London a city of letters.
Today you can go out into the high street and buy newspapers, magazines, books. In other words, we take the printed word for granted. But 1,000 years ago, things were very different. The only way of getting words onto parchment was like this, with a quill pen. And that was a slow, laborious process. First you had to catch your goose, and then you take the feathers from the left wing, which meant they curl comfortably for the right-handed writer. And then you trim them with your pen knife, from the Latin penna for feather, and then you start writing like this. It takes ages. To write out a whole book like a Bible would take years, which meant that books were very rare and indeed very expensive. But that didn't really matter too much because very few people could read.
Printing arrived in Europe in 1440, when a German called Johannes Gutenberg started making Bibles, and there are still Gutenberg Bibles around today. His printing press was based on the grape and olive presses already around at the time, only now he was producing words rather than wine or oil. The process spread across Europe and arrived in London in 1476, thanks to William Caxton, who was a successful wool merchant. He turned his hand to translating works from French into English, and he was the first person to print a book in the English language. In one of London's quiet alleyways can be found a building that houses a treasure trove of old printing presses and sets of type in many different typefaces. Here are all the tools of the printing trade.
I've come to the St Bride Library just off Fleet Street because here they know all about printing, and the librarian is Nigel Roach. Nigel, what was the impact of printing when it started?
Oh, it massively increased the number of books which were available in Europe.
Right, OK, mass production in other words.
Mass production within its age.
Now, Caxton was the bloke who brought it here. What did he print?
He printed for the top of the social triangle, for the king and the nobility. That's the market he was going for.
Saucy foreign stories?
Oh, slightly saucy, but The Legend of Good Women doesn't sound that saucy. But if you are thinking of the mass production of popular literature, I think you have to look to his successor, Wynkyn de Worde. After Caxton's death, he moved his equipment up here to Fleet Street about 1500, and he's known as the father of Fleet Street.
Ah, so that was the first printing press in Fleet Street?
Yes, the first actually in Fleet Street.
Oh, wonderful. Anyway, could we do a bit of printing?
We could, yes. I mean, over there we can do something.
Right. Now, can I put the last few letters in?
Yes, they're here.
OK. Are they brass, these letters?
No, these bigger ones are wood. The smaller ones down the bottom there are lead and tin and antimony. Now, secure it with these wedges.
That's tightening that up there, right. So it's not going to move?
That's right. No.
All right.
Time to ink it.
We need ink, don't we?
I can offer you the sort of thing that Caxton used,
right,
or the 19th century equivalent.
Well, let me try this. This is leather, is it?
Yes.
And you've got ink on it?
It's already inked, so...
Sort of like that?
That's right.
Right, let me try the roller for the others.
You may prefer the roller.
I would say the roller is easier. So is this the sort of press that Caxton would have used?
It's very similar in its mechanical principles. Caxton's press would have been made of wood. This is the same sort of thing made in iron.
OK. OK, can I put the paper on?
Pop it on.
Well, I reckon...
Position it nicely.
About there. This goes down.
That's it. Close it down.
And then winch it underneath, yes?
In, that's right. And then you'll see the printing happening.
Somewhere like that.
Good.
And then pull the lever.
That's it. And don't forget to dwell at this end. So
for how long?
Actually, a few seconds.
Is that long enough?
That's fine. So that the ink transfers to the paper.
Right, and then wipe this out again.
Out. Let's see what you've done.
Made a mess, I expect. That's usually what I do. Well, it's still there. Are you ready? Oh, look at that. Not bad. Oh, hey. Oh, that's very neat. How London was built. So what sort of type is this?
That's exactly the sort of type that Caxton used. It's a 15th century Gothic used in one of his books.
It's quite difficult to read, isn't it?
They would have thought that it was really very easy to read.
Really?
That's what they were familiar with. They would have found it more difficult to read this.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Great. Oh, I've printed something.
The increase in printed materials meant that knowledge and information became available to a wider group of people. However, books were still relatively expensive, so that only the rich could afford them. A historian and essayist called Thomas Carlyle reckoned that Londoners would benefit from a major independent library. Of course, there was the reading room at the British Museum, but that was noisy and crowded, and you had to consult books on the spot. Carlyle envisaged a place where you could read books in a quiet reading room, or even take them away and read them in your own home.
So, in 1841, the London Library was formed, originally in offices down there in Pall Mall. But then it moved up here to St James's Square and now occupies a discreet building in the corner of the square built in 1898. One of the most extraordinary things about this building is the construction of the book stacks. You see all these steel frames which are open so the light from here goes down to the floors below. There are actually 7 floors of book stacks. The whole thing is built on a steel frame, so that the weight of the books is taken not on the walls but on the frame itself. It's a very interesting and innovative use of steel. The whole library was designed to reflect the domestic feel of its former homes. So there's lovely wooden panelling, there are portraits on the walls, there's a beautiful fireplace here and these comfortable armchairs. In fact, I once came in here after a very good lunch and had an hour's sleep and nobody complained. The library has been used by many famous authors over the years, from Tennyson and Virginia Woolf to Salman Rushdie and Alan Bennett. And there are some wonderful relics of their use here. These 4 books were actually consulted by Charles Dickens when he was writing A Tale of Two Cities, and they're still on the open stacks. I could take them out today, the very same volumes. And this I particularly like. This is an application form for life membership from George Bernard Shaw. It's dated the 12th of September 1943, and he writes on the form, "My wife, who was a life member, died this morning. As I'm in my 87th year, I shall not survive for long." And basically he's asking for a discount, which they didn't give him. And he became a life member and he lived for another 7 years. So actually, perhaps he didn't deserve it anyway.
The Victorians bought books too, like these penny dreadfuls, tales of intrigue and adventure, the equivalent of today's airport thrillers. They were also avid readers of newspapers. But the news industry was already 150 years old, and hundreds of papers and journals were available in the capital. Some, like the Times and the Observer, started their lives 220 years ago.
Nowadays, news is available on every street corner, and we're just as addicted as we ever were. This is the Evening Standard, literally hot off the press, and within the hour, these bundles of copies will be out on the streets ready for sale. Nowadays, all the printing happens in the east of the city, but there was a time when it happened right in the heart.
For over 500 years, Fleet Street and its surrounding alleys were the heart of all the major printing in London. All the big newspapers were based here, and the scramble for news went on by night and day.
This extraordinary building across the road, which has been called the Black Lubyanka, was built by Owen Williams in 1932 for the Daily Express. It has a unique concrete structure which allows for much greater floor space, and it meant that the huge printing presses down in the basement had plenty of room. He also designed the M1 motorway, but on the whole I think this looks better. This is also one of London's first and arguably finest examples of curtain walling. The walls aren't structural at all, they're all made of glass and they're just hung on the outside of the building. And that was absolutely intentional. They wanted to show that all night the journalists were slaving away inside and all the lights blazing because they had to get the news out in the morning. Outside, the building may be minimal and elegant, but here in the lobby, It's exactly the opposite. This is the first thing that visitors would see when they came into the building. Look at these silver serpents, and look at the floor, which looks like waves. I'm almost wading through them. And I have to wade through them to get to the empire. These extraordinary murals, one at each end, represent the industry of the empire. People slaving away, carrying buckets, wielding swords, you name it, they're doing it. Even when they went up, they were recognised as being hopelessly jingoistic and over the top. But the fact is, the Daily Express was selling 3 million copies every day, and they could afford to show off a bit. Just have a look at that ceiling.
London has always been seen as a literary centre, home to dramatists, novelists, the writer of the first English dictionary, Dr. Johnson, and many other writers from George Eliot to Shakespeare. However, the printing revolution had long been missing one crucial element, the mechanisation of papermaking. For hundreds of years, books were written on handmade paper. This was expensive and very time-consuming to produce.
Paper was first made in this country around 1500, and in those days it was all made by hand, and they started with cotton rags. What you actually need is any source of cellulose, and today they use a lot more wood pulp, and in between they've used all sorts of things like esparto grass. Basically it's a source of cellulose which will give you the fibres which will knit together to make the paper. What we're doing today is using old school paper which has been chewed up and is going to be recycled. You mix it with water into a sort of sludge, and then you put your sludge in a big tank of water, and that's where you make your paper from. And what I'm going to do is to lift some of those fibres out on a nylon mesh, which has actually got my ugly mug sewn into it like that. It's going to make a watermark in the paper. First of all, I dip that very carefully and then lift it up to capture some of the pulp on top of my mesh. Then turn the whole thing over, and this is quite scary, onto this bit of hand towel. So that first process was the forming, and now the pressing. So I take a sponge and I squeeze gently, which is compressing the fibres together and also taking out some of the water. Now with luck, if I lift that out, it will all come away from the mesh, and you'll find here a not very beautiful piece of paper with, look, it's got my ugly mug on it. And in fact, that needs to dry. We'll use a hot plate, but in the old days they hung them all up. And what you wind up with is something like that. Isn't that terrific?
This method of making paper was slow, and sheets were limited to the largest size of frame a man could carry. In 1802, mechanisation was introduced into the process when two London stationers, the Fourdrinier brothers, introduced the world's first paper machine. It may look primitive, but this was the beginning of a great industry. This is Frogmore Mill in Apsley, just outside London. It's home to Britain's oldest working paper mill.
I've come down now to see the big Fourdrinier machine, and I'm with Mike Stanion, who knows about how it works. They're just getting up steam. Mike, before it starts going, tell me how it works.
Well, first of all, the pulp comes down at this end onto this is called the wire.
And this is the same as that little mesh I was using?
More or less the same as that, yes.
Okay.
But very quickly, the liquid drains through. It goes underneath, and it's pumped back upstairs to be recycled for the next batch.
Right.
The water is sucked out, and then it passes under this rotating dandy roll, which smooths the surface of the paper.
Ah, so it's less lumpy than mine was.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And here we have the press roll. This was what you were doing with the sponge.
Oh, the sponge.
Yes, this is actually the press.
So it's like a mangle.
Absolutely. And then it passes through here into the drying section, where there's 20-odd cylinders, all heated by steam, to help evaporate the rest of the water that's in the paper.
Where does the steam come from?
That is the exhaust from the steam engine, which is actually driving the whole of the machine.
It's all driven by steam?
Absolutely.
Oh, wonderful. And so you're recycling the steam to heat the rollers, all 20 of them. That's terrific. Now, tell me about these things here.
That is a Mulready envelope. This one is 170 years old. It's a piece of paper from the very first postal system in this country. They're made at the next mill down by a man called John Dickinson. He was around right at the time when the penny post was being introduced. And this was pre-printed, so you went to the post office, you bought your envelope for 2p, you then wrote
on the back,
the inside,
yes, and then just folded it up so it becomes its own envelope.
You then sent it off and it was delivered. But they were afraid at the time that people were going to forge these things because anyone could print them.
Because the stamp was on it?
Because the stamp was on it. So what they did was they inserted into the paper, while it was wet, in the machine, some threads of silk.
Oh, yes.
And you can see
You can see them there, yes.
And that was an anti-forgery idea.
Very clever. And did that idea catch on?
Yes, it's still going today. If you've got some money,
Money?
some notes.
Me?
Yes.
Well, I do happen to have one note here, yes. Ah, so you mean this metal strip?
That metal strip derived from this idea.
Oh, that's very clever, isn't it? Thank you very much indeed.
With the advances in paper-making, printing and literacy came the necessity to keep copies of all printed works, from penny dreadfuls to Shakespeare. And one place that held a copy of everything was the Library at the British Museum, our first true national library. People would come to consult books inside the huge domed reading room built in the museum's great court. When the library moved to new premises in the 90s, the museum decided to renovate and open up the courtyard to the public.
This is the Great Court of the British Museum. 150 years ago, the Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, had been such a success. They were going to put a glass roof right over the top, but it never happened until the year 2000. And finally they did it, and the chap responsible was Steve Brown. It almost looks as if it could have been done in one piece. Did you try that?
It can't be one piece because it's 72 metres wide and 95 metres long, and it's very hard to move.
It's a big piece of glass.
It's a big piece.
Yes.
But it acts as one piece, and it all works like a card. A card is stiff, and if you try and bend it, it pops back again.
Right.
But if you actually fold the card,
right,
you have one piece, which is the roof.
Right.
And this thing goes from the reading room across to the quadrangle building around the edge.
Are you telling me this is flexible, this roof?
It is, it's flexible. It moves every day, in and out. As the sun comes up, it grows. As the sun goes in, it shrinks.
Oh, amazing. By how much?
Well, about 20 millimetres in breadth, and it goes up and down by about 10. And it does it so that we're able to preserve the historic nature of the quadrangle building around the Great Court, but also the reading room in the middle. What we couldn't do was have the roof lean or push against it. So we put sliding bearings all the way around here, so the whole roof slides on the roof above, on the existing buildings.
Wonderful. Isn't it like an oven in here in the summer when the sun shines?
We're in the summer now, and there's a couple of little tricks to it.
Yes.
The first thing, it's double glazed. Also, there's a ceramic frit based on the glass.
Frits?
It's a little, like a ceramic dot on top of the glass,
right,
which allows only 35% of the light to get into the space.
Really?
We also control the temperature using the floor. If you touch the floor now, you'll feel it's cold. We're in the summertime, and in the summertime we pump cold water through the floor to actually chill the floor. And in the winter, we reverse that process, and we pump warm water through the floor.
Oh, so that's very neat.
So the area that we're all standing in, the bottom 2 metres, remains fairly temperate. Up the top, where nobody is, we can all look at it, but the temperature is quite different.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it gets quite warm up there in the summer.
The books may have left Bloomsbury and the British Museum, but they are now housed in the new British Library, the largest public building constructed in the 20th century. A book is published every 30 seconds, which means that 1 million new books a year are added to these stacks, and that doesn't include magazines and journals. After decades of planning, the British Library opened in 1997. The architect, Sandy Wilson, was very keen on things nautical, and if you look, it's very much like a ship. It's got a funnel and a bridge, and all the way around here, the bows sticking out over the Euston Road. And look, there's even a porthole. And if you look above the porthole, that's the Midland Hotel next to St Pancras Station, famously Victorian Gothic. But
the brick is almost the same colour as this. And that's because Sandy deliberately got clay from the same quarry, so that the bricks are identical colour in the British Library as they are in the Midland Hotel. In fact, even the slates on the roof are the same. It's a wonderful match, even though the style of the building is so different.
There are 9 reading rooms where people can come and consult books and other materials. The library also houses some pretty impressive treasures, such as the Magna Carta, the first Shakespeare folio, the Beatles song lyrics, and the last words of Captain Scott.
This building is absolutely vast. There are 625 kilometres of shelves, and every year they grow by 12 more kilometres. It's amazing. So, where are all the books? Well, most of them are underground. Below the surface, there are 4 more floors completely full of books. It's a bit like an iceberg. Most of this building is invisible to the naked eye.
There are over 150 million items in the collections, ranging from books, journals, plates and maps, to posters, photos, and even a lock of Napoleon's hair. Items can be ordered upstairs or online. The requests are sent down to the basement, where books are fetched and dispatched to the required reading room. Every day, a hidden network of conveyor belts transports thousands of books around the building. There are over 6,000 possible routes. Whatever you need to know, from the latest news in particle physics to the colour of Napoleon's hair, the British Library is the place to come, the ultimate resource for Londoners. This enormous building represents the thirst for knowledge and understanding that have really made this city great.